Good morning. My name is Emily Derenne. I am a Natural Resource Project Manager with Skagit County, and I wanted to welcome you today to the North Sound Riparian Conference. This is our fourth one. Today is being hosted by the Skagit River System Cooperative, the Skagit Watershed Council, Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group, the Skagit Land Trust, and then my agency, Skagit County. And you'll see representatives from all those organizations here today. I'm sure most of you are aware, it looks like we've already got a great turnout today. That's great. I'm sure most of you are aware we have a Google group. It's the Western Washington Riparian Workgroup. It's a great place to network, to ask questions. There's a lot of commentary that goes back and forth. If you're not currently on there, you can join by emailing Brenda Clifton at bclifton@skagitcoop.org.
All right, our first speaker is Christina St John. Christina is the coordinator of the Clallam County Noxious Weed Control Program. Prior to accepting that position in the spring of 2022, she worked in the fields of native plant propagation and restoration ecology. She has a master's in sustainable forest management from Oregon State University, and has worked at native plant nurseries and restoration projects in Washington State, California, and North Carolina. Although she now spends most of her time killing weeds and educating other people about the importance of killing weeds, and she loves doing that, she also enjoys discussing native plants and takes way too many pictures of pollinators on native plants.
Thank you for having me speak today. So today I'm going to talk about a wetland mitigation site where we were attempting to create a native wetland in an area that was dominated by weed canarygrass, and kind of the surprising success that we had for that. Okay, so this wetland mitigation project was part of the Lower Dungeness Levee Setback and Floodplain Restoration Project, which I'm sure some of you are already familiar with. So just a quick recap. This project occurred between River Mile 0.8 and River Mile 2.7. So it's pretty close to the mouth of the Dungeness River in eastern Clallam County, a few miles north of the city of Sequim. And this area was homesteaded by dairy farmers who converted the floodplain into pasture. In the 1960s, a levee was built right along the Dungeness River to prevent the river from flooding that area, which prevented the farms and homes from being flooded, but obviously caused the river to be channelized and reduce the amount of floodplain vegetation and habitat that was available to fish and other wildlife. And so a number of different partner organizations came together to figure out a way to open up the floodplain, hoping to increase the habitat for salmon and other fish. After many years of outreach to the public and acquiring land, the project has been able to set back the levee and reconnect the river with 180 acres of its floodplain. And so again, this project was a real community effort, and there have been a lot of different organizations and government agencies involved. And the two organizations that are leading this effort are the Jamestown Clallam Tribe, which took the lead in the southern part of the project, and the Clallam County Department of Community Development, which took the lead in the northern part of the project. So even though these two agencies were the ones leading the project, there were 4 different organizations that own land within project boundaries. In addition to Clallam County and Jamestown Clallam Tribe, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife also owns a lot of land, as does the Washington Department of Transportation, who has some wetland mitigation sites out there. And my organization, the Clallam County Noxious Weed Control Board, we performed weed control primarily for county and tribally owned lands. The last year we did a little bit of weed control for WDFW. And so we were really excited to be able to do a coordinated weed control effort throughout this project. Obviously, the site has had a lot of land uses over the years, and the river is obviously bringing down a lot of weed seeds. So we had some significant weed populations that we were dealing with. The biggest one that we were dealing with was poison hemlock, especially in the northern section of this project. And the Noxious Weed Control Board has been working on the site for years to get that under control. But the other weeds that we were working with were common teasel, Himalayan blackberry, Bohemian knotweed, butterfly bush, and reed canarygrass. And for today, I'm going to focus on some of the efforts that we did for reed canarygrass. Reed canarygrass is a Class C noxious weed. And so a little background, a noxious weed is a non-native plant that, when established, is highly destructive, competitive, and difficult to control. And invasive plants that are designated noxious weeds by the Washington State Noxious Weed Board, so it is a legal term. And so while reed canary grass is widespread and there's no way to ever be able to eradicate it from the state, we do recommend control of it in high priority areas. Now, reed canary grass is actually native to North America, and there were native stands of it on the peninsula, but pretty much everything that we see nowadays is actually the highly invasive Eurasian genotype that was brought over in order to be used as forage, even though animals can only eat it very early in the spring. Otherwise, it's too tough for anybody to use. So this plant, even though it's native, it's acting differently than it used to, and has invaded new areas since this Eurasian genotype was introduced. And there's no way to tell the native genotype from the invasive genotype without genetic testing, and they interbreed. So there's probably very little of the native genotype left on the peninsula or anywhere in North America. So reed canary grass, it's a perennial grass that forms these really dense monocultures that outcompetes all other native plants. And these stands, again, are not really utilized by wildlife. The grass can only be eaten for a very short time in the spring before it gets too tough. And we really don't see a lot of wildlife using these stands like you would other plants that grow in wetlands. And it can completely choke out small streams, making them unusable for fish. So reed canary grass spreads by seeds and by underground stems called rhizomes. And these rhizomes really form a dense mat underground that prevent any other plants from coming up. And you can't get a shovel through it. It's really dense. And the seeds will remain viable in the soil for over 20 years. Because of this really dense rhizome network and the fact that there's a really long seed bank in there, this is a really difficult plant to control. And for the most part, control is done through herbicide or trying to shade it out, since it seems to grow best in wet and sunny locations. But control is really difficult, and it can take many years to occur, if it even occurs at all. Okay, so now that we've done a little background information on the project and reed canary grass, let's talk about this specific site and what happened there. For this project, the county hired a private contractor to build a new levee, which is, you can see on the screen, it's kind of snaking through the middle of the picture. This part of the levee goes through WSDOT mitigation sites, and so it was very important that the construction crew stay within the really narrow footprint. But on the first day of their construction in September of 2021, they accidentally left that footprint and bulldozed an area that had been planted as part of a WSDOT mitigation site. And I've highlighted it on the left side of the photo. In order to make up for that, the contractor had to replant that area that was bulldozed. And then they also had to create a half-acre wetland that was originally pure reed canary grass, and they had to make it mostly natives. And so that was that site was chosen. It's about 1,500 feet away. I've labeled it in the middle of it, and it's in this picture, it's highlighted by the orange silting fence. And so there's another scraped area in between that, and I'll talk about that site at the end. And this picture was taken the end of December of 2022. So in November, the two levees were connected, and then in December, the whole area got flooded. So it was really fun to see this project be successful almost right away. With the creation of this half-acre wetland occurred in the middle of the May, and because reed canary grass is so difficult to control, the previous coordinator for Clallam County Noxious Weed Control Board, Kathy Lucero, she convinced county engineers who wrote the construction contract to require the contractor to manually remove reed canary grass within the footprint of the levee and anywhere that we're going to be working. And so what the contractor did was they used a backhoe to scrape the top foot of the reed canary grass out. And so that includes all the top growth and all the rhizomes and the seed bank that's underneath it. And so they would take that top foot of topsoil and rhizomes, they would put it in a get rid of it, and it was getting hauled off site to an old county pit that we were trying to fill in. That's what the contractor did to create this half-acre wetland. And unfortunately, I don't have any before pictures of the site. I'm sure somebody does. But this is the picture while they were doing that on the left. You can see that on the left-hand side of the picture, I pointed out where the reed canary grass is. That was the entire site. It was just covered in reed canary grass. As part of this mitigation requirements, the contractor had to install a bunch of these mounds and plant native species on it. They planted 6 different native species on the mounds, 1 plant of each one. But that turned out to be unnecessary, and I'll show you why. And then the contractor also spread out a bunch of native seed, but that also turned out to be pretty unnecessary too. Okay, so the picture on the left, you can see that another part of this project that was really important is that this site was completely surrounded by either willows or cottonwoods. Willows and cottonwoods, they drop their seeds in early June usually, and the seeds are only viable for a couple of weeks. And so the willow and cottonwood seeds have to drop down onto wet, bare soil right away in order to germinate and live. Otherwise, those seeds die. There's no seed bank for those. Well, luckily, this site was created in the middle of May, and so there was a lot of bare ground available in June, and you can see that on the right. So that's what the site looked like right after they were completed. Even in June, this site was really flooded, and it stayed flooded for most of the time. So this is the site 2 months later, and so although this site was seeded, I didn't see any of the species from that seed mix come up. Instead, all the seeds that were sitting in the soil under the Canarygrass and under those rhizomes, they all started to germinate in really amazing numbers. So within 2 months, this site became dominated by cattails, small-flowered bulrush, horsetails, obviously, and other rushes and sedges. And because there was all this bare ground that was available when the cottonwoods and the willows were dropping their seeds, we just had thousands and thousands of these willows come up in the site. And on the right-hand picture, I've pointed out some of the willow cottonwood seedlings. There has to be at least 100 or 200 of them just in that frame of that picture. There was so many of them, and it was really amazing and remarkable how quickly the native plants came up and kind of took over this site. So my crew and I only performed 1 weed treatment on this site. It was in September of 2022, and it was pretty minimal. Of course, because the site is still surrounded by Canarygrass, and the only thing in between the Canarygrass and the mitigation site is the silt fencing. Obviously, the Canarygrass is creeping underneath the silt fencing and spreading back into the site. So we did treat the Canarygrass that's coming up. There were a little bit that was germinating in the middle of the site. Either pieces of the rhizome had broken off and got reestablished, or there was some seeds left over. And then we also did a little bit of Canada and bull thistle, but it really took us almost no time at all. This site is really dominated by native plants, and there really wasn't a lot of non-native stuff that was in there. Okay, so here's the site in October of 2022. So just 5 months after scraping, it is dominated by native plants. It's really just absolutely amazing. So prior to May, this site was, completely dominated by Canarygrass and had provided almost no wildlife value or ecosystem services. And 5 months later, it is now dominated by native plants. I've never seen a restoration site respond this fast to this. It was really amazing. And it's really the only, there are still some areas around there that are dominated by native plants, but this one is really amazing. And how quickly it came back was quite unbelievable. Okay, so here's the site in fall of 2023. So just a couple of months ago. And it still looks really fantastic. My program is noxious weed control, and so we don't have the funding or the crew to do a really thorough vegetation survey on this site, but we did do a really quick survey to see what was coming up and what was growing. And so here are some of the dominant native plants that we were finding on that site. So common cattail, horsetail is obviously doing well out there. Lots of willows and cottonwoods. They're mostly the Sitka willow and the Pacific willow. We've got a lot of rushes, the native willow herb, and then soft stem and small fruited bulrush. We did do a little bit of a small amount of treatment for weeds in 2023. And again, it was mostly targeting the Canarygrass along the edges, and then the thistles that have started to come in here. But for the most part, we weren't really needing to do that much. I think it took us maybe half an hour to walk through the site and treat stuff. It's still really dominated by native plants. So here's some of the cottonwoods and willows that have germinated on site. I figured since so much had come in last year that this spring there wouldn't be a lot of willow and cottonwood recruitment, but we did actually see another cohort come down and germinate. So now we've kind of got this 2-layer of the 1-year-old cottonwoods and willows, and now we have some little ones that are germinating too. The willows and cottonwoods are really dominating in areas that are a little above water. So if you think back to that picture that I showed when there weren't any plants on it, it was all dominated by water. But by the end of the season, it's mostly just the northern part that's dominated by water. The southern part is a little higher, and so is the eastern edge. And that area is definitely dominated by this willow and cottonwood germination. So I assume within a couple of years, these shrubs are going to be taking over and really dominate that part of the site. But there is still standing water, even in the dry season in the northern part of the site. And we've had very little of the willow and cottonwood recruitment there. And it's still dominated by cattails. So it looks like it's going to stay that way because of all the water that's just sitting right there. So of course, there are still some non-native plants that have come in, especially in that southern area that is really dry. And in that drier southern part, we do see a lot more of the pasture weeds like white clover, creeping buttercup, and trefoil. And then surrounding the site, especially on the northern and eastern edge, we still have these really dense stands of reed canarygrass. And you can see on the bottom of the left picture, we have Canada thistle that is also creeping underneath the fence. So Canada thistle spreads a lot like reed canarygrass, where it has these underground stems that it'll use to creep out. And then if you break off any parts of that underground stem, it'll just create a new plant. So it's really going to be a constant battle to keep those plants back and keep this little half-acre native. But it's really amazing how well this site is standing up. I thought it would have invaded a lot faster, but it's looking really good. You can see on the right-hand picture, that's a lot of that white clover that was coming in. Again, the southern part of the site is a little drier, and you're getting a little bit more of these pasture weeds coming in. Okay, so here's one of those planted mounds in fall of 2023. So this was 15 months after installation. So while most of those native plants have survived, they're pretty stunted and the horsetails have taken over. And really the mounds were the space that had the least amount of native plants. And we did see a little bit more of the weeds on those mounds. Putting in those native plants didn't hurt, but they also didn't help. So as part of that mitigation site, the contractor was required to plant Sitka spruce because it was one of the trees that WashDOT had planted at their mitigation site that they had accidentally bulldozed. Spruce doesn't really occur in the Dungeness Valley, and it doesn't like growing in wetlands or in standing water, which we have a lot of it in this area. So they've mostly died or in the process of dying. Conifers can often take a couple of years before they look like they're dead, but they're for the most part dying off there. So this is just an important reminder to think about a specific site and tailor the plants that you put there, rather than using the same species on every site. That hardly ever works. Okay, so that was the wetland mitigation site. And in that photo that I showed of the entire site, I point out there was another scraped area kind of right in between that. And so it's about 500 feet away from the wetland mitigation site. The contractor was also required to scrape another area. And they were doing that in order to remove topsoil that was contaminated with poison hemlock seeds. Side note, that did not work. And there's still a ton of poison hemlock seeds, and that did not work at all. So this site was not part of any mitigation. We were just trying to get rid of the poison hemlock seeds. So the scraping here occurred in the same way, where the contractor removed the top foot of topsoil and it was hauled off site to our old county pit. And this work occurred also in the May of 2022. So I think it was either a couple of days or maybe a week before the other site. So they were really done pretty much at the same time. So this site, while close to the wetland mitigation site, was really actually pretty different. And so it's much drier. And prior to the scraping, it was dominated by different kinds of pasture grasses, like perennial ryegrass and orchard grass. And if you look kind of up against the trees, you can see that that's still all that pasture grass that's there. And there was very little reed canary grass. There wasn't any standing water or wet soil during construction and on site. And so we didn't really see any germination from the native seed bank, and almost no recruitment from the willows and cottonwoods that are around there. You can't see in this picture, but just to the bottom right, there is actually a willow stand there. So there are willows that are really close to this site. So even though we didn't see any native seed come up, we did hydroseed the area, and it was planted with bare roots in the fall of 2022. And that's what you see growing there right now. So even though the scraping didn't lead to any native seed bank being exposed and germinating, removing the pasture grasses was actually a good thing, because it gave the hydroseeding and the bare root plants an opportunity to get established. Both would have probably failed if the pasture grass had remained. Pasture grass, just your standard pasture grass, while it doesn't have those underground rhizomes like the reed canary grass, they are really thick, fibrous roots. And if anybody's tried to dig through pasture grass with a shovel, it's really difficult. And plants feel the same way. If you were just to dig a really small hole into pasture grasses and put a plant there and fill it in and walk away, chances are those pasture grass roots would come back in and choke that plant anyway. So the scraping, while not bringing in any native seed bank, was actually a good thing, because it is helping our bare root plants. I'm showing this slide because it's really interesting that we had two sites that were treated the same way and that were really close to each other, but had completely different results. And it really just poses some more questions, like, why didn't this scrape area have any seed bank germination? And I mean, it just poses more questions than we can answer. And so, we've been trying to debate about why that might be. And is it because there wasn't enough water in the seed bank to germinate? So again, in May, the wetland mitigation site was flooded. Here it was actually pretty dry. And so is it maybe that the soil was too dry for this native seed bank to germinate? And my best guess is no, because once the rains came, we still didn't see any native stuff come up, and we didn't see any native seed bank come up this spring either, spring of 2023. So it was, and there was still a lot of land that was exposed, and there was enough moisture. So my best guess, and it's completely a guess at this point, is that the site being drier, it had been pasture for at least 80 years. So again, there were a lot of dairy farms in this area, and they converted a lot of the shrub forest and wetlands into pasture grass. If this area had been pasture grass for at least 80 years, then any native seed that would have been in the soil would have died by this point. But the wetland area that was dominated by reed canary grass, there was obviously standing water there, and even during the summer months. And so chances are it was too wet for pasture grass, and it probably remained a native wetland for a longer time before the reed canary grass invaded and took over. So it might have allowed the native seeds to be viable, because they weren't sitting underneath the reed canary grass for quite as long. We really don't know why these two sites acted differently, but I'm hoping somebody will take up the question and maybe do a little bit of research on this. So this site is open. So this is the site from, if you're standing on the levee looking back, and you can really see how the reed canary grass that got mowed down during construction has come right back up, and it's kind of surrounding this site. This is one of my favorite projects that I worked on since I started this job, and it's really inspiring. And you can see that this wetland mitigation site is just this little island of native plants. While driving on the levee in the spring, you kind of drive along and you kind of hear some birds, but not really. And then as you drive past this, there were so many frogs and birds and life in this little half-acre native wetland mitigation. And then you drive past it again, and it gets quiet again. So this is a really cool site, and if anybody's on the peninsula, I really encourage you to come out and see it. It is available. So that's my talk. So I'm open to answering any questions if anybody has some.
Thanks, Christina. Can you see the Q&A box?
Oh, here we go. Okay.
Yeah, there are tons of questions.
Okay, yeah, so somebody's asked what's the relative elevation difference between the hummocks and the hollows. The hummocks were 18 inches tall. I've got a question. Do you know how long the reed canarygrass has been established on the site? I wonder if more recently established was easier to remove from bulldozing. I don't know how long it was there, but it was pretty solid reed canarygrass, so I don't think it would have been, I don't think it could have gotten more established. But I am wondering if it hasn't been there for very long, if that affected whether the native seeds underneath it were still able to be viable, because at some point the seeds will die. Okay, someone asking me what the herbicide control was. So we do spot spraying, and we primarily used it was a Imazapry. So Polaris is the brand name, and so that is a it's a systemic herbicide that is works on grasses and broadleaf plants, and so we're really using that because it's the best thing to use for the reed canarygrass. We use a little bit of a broadleaf herbicide just to get some of the Canada thistle, because it doesn't respond as well to Imazapry. But again, spot spraying, we used very little, like ounces of herbicide, that very little was actually put in here. Okay, so someone asked, what did they do with the dirt that was removed? It was took to an old county pit and filled in. So it just got dumped into a hole in a county pit. And nothing has really come up from there. We take care of that pit, and we haven't seen any of that reed canarygrass come back up. Someone's asked what species were included in the seed mix, if the rushes and the sedges that popped up. I don't know what they were off the top of my head, but no, there were no rushes and sedges in that seed mix. It was like a wetland grass mix. And I can get that information for somebody, but none of the species that came up were in that grass mix. I just don't know what they are at the moment. So someone's asked how long that we're going to leave that construction fencing in place after construction. I'm not sure. So because this was a mitigation site for the contractor to make up for bulldozing it, the other part of the mitigation site, they have to do monitoring on it. And I think it's for 5 years. And so I think the silt fencing is going to be up there for the entirety of that monitoring, so that we know where the mitigation site is and where we have to monitor, because as part of that mitigation, they had to make sure that the reed canarygrass wasn't going to get over 20%, and then we needed a certain amount of cover, and we're easily doing that. My hope is that we can find some funding and we can remove more of the reed canarygrass that's bordering this, and then we hopefully will take the silt fencing off of that. But the silt fencing is going to be up there for as long as we need to monitor. So it looks like someone's saying that they have a small site and was told by the city that they could not use any equipment at all on that site. I'm assuming you're talking about a wetland site. I don't know about whether what kind of regulations each city has for different wetlands. I'm sure that WASDOT also has different ones. This project had to go through a lot of permitting in order to be able to use large equipment in a wetland. And if you reach out to Clallam County Department of Community Development, Kathy Lear is the project head there that had to deal with all of the permitting in order to be able to use large equipment in a wetland. And so she might be the best one to reach out to about that. But yeah, that has to do with different regulations in different counties in the state. Okay, so someone's asked, how did the horsetails and cattails get established so quickly? Were they part of the native seed mix, part of the deep seed bank, or were there healthy populations around the edge of the treatment area? Exactly, that's really the big question. So they were not part of the native seed mix. There are not really healthy populations around it. The picture that I have here, you can really see that there aren't really any cattails directly adjacent to this site. So it's not like they also spread by rhizomes, and so it's not like they creeped in. There is a little bit of cattail on the other side of this willow on the right-hand side of the picture. But what I think is that they came through in the seed bank, and it was just really shocking how quickly these things came back up. Someone's asking if there's any nutrient replenishment done to the soil after scraping. Nope, didn't add any nutrients to this site. And it doesn't look like we need to. It seems to be that they're just doing great. The top foot of topsoil that we took out, there was really very little topsoil in it. It was almost solidly reed canarygrass rhizomes and the seeds that were there. It really shows how damaging that plant can be. It really just smothered everything and came to dominate. And everything that was there beforehand was just sitting underneath that reed canarygrass. This site, I think, is the most vivid example we have of how noxious weeds coming into a site really destroys a site and completely changes it, and how a site can rebound once these noxious weeds come out. But no, there was no nutrients that were added to this. Okay, so scraping can cause compaction, which can promote ponding in wetland conditions, but also create poor conditions. So yeah, so as far as the compaction goes, because of how wet this site was in May and really through the entire summer, the contractor had a difficult time getting their equipment in. So there was very little equipment movable in here. They had to put down these like mats that the backhoe could get in there, and then they scraped. And once they scraped, they did not go back to the site. And I believe that was also done on the other scraping site, though mostly because we didn't want the bulldozer to accidentally bring in more poison hemlock seeds on their tires. So they tried to be very good about removing it and not going over it. I think afterwards they might have gone over it a little bit. So as far as compaction for the wetland site, I don't think that's an issue because of how wet it was and not being able to get equipment in. But that could definitely have been an issue on site too. But again, we have seen the hydroseeding come up, and the bare root plants are doing okay, and they weren't having an issue planting into it. So I don't think compaction is too much of an issue here. Okay, so the next question, was the equipment treated on site to remove any potential propagules? If so, how? Yeah, we talked to the contractor about keeping their equipment clean and making sure that they weren't moving dirt around. I would have to reach out to them to figure out if they were washing it in a specific site or if they were brushing it off. But based on the fact that they didn't spread anything into this site, at least any of the reed canarygrass seeds or the poison hemlock seeds that they were working with, they seem to do a pretty good job. Okay, so somebody's asked about the cultural resources review process for this project and whether there were any hesitations about using the scraping method. So again, I wasn't part of the permitting process, so I would defer that if anybody wants to reach out to Clallam County Department of Community Development and reach out to Kathy Lear there. She would know about that and what kind of permitting was required. Is there any chance, so the next one, is there any chance to treat the reed canarygrass on the other side of the fence from the restoration site? I really hope so. We are talking about whether there's money available to scrape around it. You can see how dense it is. It really isn't practical for us to spray it. Now, if we could use herbicide on it, unfortunately, I have a very small crew, and this is only one small part of the project that we work on. We also do weed control for the rest of this 180 acres. We do weed control for the roadside. So unfortunately, even if we had the money and we don't have the money or the time to use herbicide around here, there may be money to scrape the remaining reed canarygrass around here. But the project is coming to an end and there are other obligations for that money. And so we'll see. But what my crew and myself are doing is we're walking around the area and mapping those reed canarygrass populations so that if money does become available to scrape, we'll know how much is out there and we can quickly get out there. But currently there isn't any plans to treat the reed canarygrass around there. Okay, so we have another question. So one of the groups that I work with finally received permission to survey a section of a creek. And we were wondering why the coho were not migrating upstream. And they're all being held back by reed canarygrass, and hoping to find a solution this summer. Shading seems to be the best answer long term. So yeah, I've also heard from other organizations that they are saying that reed canarygrass is preventing salmon from using, especially the smaller streams. Shading is definitely a way to go. It's a lot cheaper, and it's important to think about what was there before. We don't want to make everything into a willow and cottonwood stand if it wasn't already there before. There are a lot of other really important plants, and the emergent wetland plants are really also important to have there. And shading, so oftentimes I see people put in willow stakes right into the reed canarygrass, and where that can work, sometimes it's important to know what the water table is, and know that if it was easy to get rid of this reed canarygrass, we would already have it all gone. The shading it out is very difficult, and it does require a lot of maintenance, going out there, making sure those plants survive, because even if you were to put willow stakes in, or you put in bare root plants and then you weed whack around it to get the above ground competition away, there's still a lot of below ground competition. And that's really the problem with reed canarygrass, is that there's no room for roots for any other plants there. They're really good at outcompeting that and preventing any other plants from getting established. So shading is definitely a way, and people have had success, but just know that you can't just stick willow cuttings in and then walk away. There's a lot more to it than that. Another person is asking about permitting, and then again, I wasn't involved in the permitting section, so I recommend people reach out to Kathy Lear with the Clallam County Department of Community Development. She was involved with that. Okay, so we've got somebody who just wanted to make a comment. So they went to a field day example of restoration in a wetland area that was under heavy cropping for over 100 years, and they still had the historical seed bank come back. So she recommends we're reaching out to the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District in Oregon and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to chat to them about what they were seeing. So that is really cool. That's really cool that those plants were able to come back. It's really cool when we can use what's already there and we don't have to put in our own inputs. Restoration really does best working with the surrounding landscape, and so that's what we were able to do here, and that's what made it so successful. We could have put in plants, and we did, and those really didn't do as well as those native plants that were already there, and then the seeds that got brought in. So yes, so somebody says, I thought Imazapry made it so plants cannot grow there for quite some time, but that was not the case here. Actually, it is the case. So Imazapry, again, it has a long residual, so it will prevent anywhere that it's sprayed. It will prevent plants from coming back for, it's about a year on the Olympic Peninsula. But because we were just doing a spot spraying, and it didn't affect most of the site, just the little areas that we were spraying, and we kind of had to balance that out with the fact that Imazapry really is the best chemical that we know to come back. Some of it, especially there were some tiny patches in the middle of the mitigation site. Those are coming from seeds. And so we did want to use the Imazapry because then it prevents new germination from reed canarygrass seeds. So yes, we do have little patches that don't have anything growing in it, but they're really small, and it really hasn't affected the mitigation site as a whole. Okay, so somebody's commenting, they did a lot of work on prairie and pasture grass restoration in South Sound prairies in the 2000s and 2010s. The conclusion is that pasture grass and degraded prairies do not have much native seed bank. Seeding plugging was essential to increase nativity in these upland sites. Anecdotally, adjacent wetland areas dominated by reed canarygrass had long absent native species pop up after a pipeline was installed through the area with significant soil disturbance. Not as dramatic as what you're showing, though. This varied response to topsoil removal really lends itself to a stage scale approach. Do a small test area, monitor response, and then expand if successful, and that these are really encouraging results. So yeah, I'm really glad to hear that we're not the only place that has had something like this, where these the seed bank kind of pops back up again. Super, really, really inspiring. And I know because it involves scraping and heavy equipment in wetland that there's really a limited use for this. But if you're able to do it, I mean, what other way have we ever had native wetland come back in 5 months from an area that was dominated by Canarygrass? That's kind of really unbelievable. Okay, so we've got the next question. What lessons were learned from the perspective of contracting best practices? Yeah, so I mean, certainly if you have somebody who's got a backhoe and you've got Canarygrass around, that really is the best way to remove it. I know that herbicide is often used and it's really the only option in many places, but if you have an opportunity to remove Canarygrass by just scraping the top foot off, boy, does that really work well. And then we really talked to the contractor about moving how they could possibly move around weed seeds because of there were areas that they were working through that had poison hemlock, and that worked really well. The only thing that didn't work well is that topsoil from the footprint of the levee was then stored to be used to put on the sides of the levee. And that was why we had scraped that second site that had poison hemlock seeds. And that turned out not to work very well. And that topsoil still got contaminated. Again, it wasn't getting moved around by the equipment. It was just in the topsoil that had been stored that we thought was clean and then got put on the sides of the levee. So I have personally removed about 700, poison hemlock seedlings on the side of a levee. And my crew has done a lot more than that. So I would recommend that if you ever get a chance, make sure that you're using clean material all the time. It's not worth the expense if you think that topsoil might be contaminated. Using old topsoil is just always a bad idea. Okay, so someone's asking if the dead spruce are being removed or we're just going to let them decay in place. I think they're just going to be left there. They're not really doing anything. Somebody's asking if I've considered using an electrical conduit trencher to dig a narrow 3-foot trench around the site's perimeter and bury a screwed together plywood barrier to block the rhizomes from traveling underground. Huh, I've never heard of that. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, again, if the Canarygrass is only a foot underneath, then yeah, making a barrier would certainly prevent it from coming in. So that if we have a little bit of funding, but not enough to scrape around, that might be a way to do it. I think the problem is because of how wet it is, that wood would degrade pretty fast. And there's so much Canarygrass around it that at some point it's just going to move in. I don't know what the long-term future of the site is because it is surrounded by Canarygrass, but I really hope that we can find a way to expand the site and make sure that it stays native for a long time. Somebody's asking, my last question is, how long did I wait after using Imazapry before planting? So actually the Imazapry was used after planting. So it was not used anywhere where plants had been planted. But if you read the label for any Imazapry product, it will give you a date for how long you want to wait before planting. Personally, I would wait like an entire year, maybe even 2 years. But the Imazapry was, again, very spot spraying. So it did not interact with any of the planted plants. It was really just done in areas that had the Canarygrass that was coming through. So very little Imazapry actually got put out there, and it was very targeted to where the weeds were. All right, well, thank you so much. And I hope this mitigation project has inspired you as much as it has inspired me.
Madelyn Loy is the noxious weed coordinator for Skagit County. In her work with the Noxious Weed Control Board, she is responsible for inspecting noxious weeds and working with public and private landowners to ensure that noxious weeds identified are controlled or eradicated as outlined in RCW Title 17, Chapter 10, Section 140. Her prior work with Clark Public Utilities Environmental Services Department centered around riparian restoration, including invasive plant control in the Salmon Creek and East Fork Lewis River watersheds in Clark County, Washington.
Awesome. Thank you, Nathan. So I'm the noxious weed coordinator for Skagit County, and I know that pretty much everyone on the call today is probably pretty well aware of how obnoxious and costly noxious weed control can be. So today I'll be discussing ways to increase the effectiveness and kind of limit cost of noxious weed control in our local landscape. Beginning with why and how we manage noxious weeds in the first place, how those pieces fit into the puzzle, early detection, rapid response, or EDRR, some of those priority species for EDRR here in the Skagit River watershed, and a local example of EDRR in action. So beginning with why manage noxious weeds in the first place? The more boring answer, of course, is that it's legally required for many Class A and B and C noxious weeds. The more impactful answer, of course, though, is that noxious weeds harm our natural resources, including soil, water, wildlife habitat, forestry, and agriculture. Without the kind of pressures that are present in the home ranges of these invasive species, they outcompete our native or desirable plants, often forming monocultures that offer less resources to the ecosystem. We also know that some noxious weeds can transform their environment, making conditions more favorable for further infestation and less desirable for native plant recovery. Several noxious weeds can even increase soil erosion or better retain soil. It can even change soil chemistry. Let me see if I can get a laser pointer here. This species here in the upper right-hand corner, I think Laurel maybe is on the call. I appreciate you sharing your photo through the State Weed Board website. This is a species garlic mustard that has an allelopathic chemical that acts almost like an herbicide to help it, outcompete the forbs that we would normally see in a healthy forest ecosystem. Over a long enough period of time, though, this can even stifle forest regeneration. Since our native vegetation serves such important functions in the riparian ecosystems, failing to address noxious weeds undermines our riparian efforts or our restoration efforts in these areas. I also wanted to kind of point attention to the fact that noxious weeds really thrive and are spread or introduced in the first place by disturbance events. These can certainly be pretty well human-controlled situations like land clearing or moving dirt or material. But these can also be, kind of almost completely out of our control, such as in occasions like fire and flooding. The thing that all of these events have in common, of course, is that they open up space for novel plants to move in and actually encourage germination of those seeds that are lying dormant in the soil. Since the riparian area is kind of predicated on transition and flooding and flowing waters, we can expect to see disturbance. Therefore, we can anticipate and plan to deal with noxious weeds in these areas. That's where our integrated weed management plans come in. IWM or IPM is a concept that many of us are very familiar with and are doing essentially all the time. But to review, an integrated weed management plan is kind of roughly defined as the use of the most appropriate control strategies, but also has elements of prevention, monitoring, planning, and evaluation in addition to that control portion. A successful integrated weed management plan is realistic and sustainable, taking into account the resources that we have at our disposal and the follow-up that'll be needed. Integrated pest management or integrated weed management also needs to be kind of science-backed or kind of have that, selected to, have the least cost to both our pocketbooks and the environment. And some of the resources that can really help with that are available through your county noxious weed board. Also, wanted to just kind of name out a few. The Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board website has some great identification and control tips. The WSU Integrated Weed Control Project is kind of the go-to resource for biological control agents, if those are appropriate. And if chemical control is appropriate, the Pacific Northwest Weed Management Handbook has great recommendations of herbicides and rates that have been tried and found to be effective on whatever weed. Beyond that, the herbicide label will kind of help you narrow down what the correct timing and sites are for that type of control. An integrated weed management plan, again, is going to be, we'll kind of use multiple strategies from the spectrum of control, and will not be a one and done solution. I just kind of wanted to underline that failing to return to follow up or invest in sufficient site prep in the first place can really put you behind the curve and cost more in the long run. Elements of an integrated weed management plan include prevention, which we'll discuss in the next few slides. Monitoring, a lot of our sites and agencies are already doing monitoring, and this can kind of be pivoted into an EDRR system, as we'll talk about in a few slides again, as long as those doing the site visits are trained and able to kind of convey data that they're collecting out in the field. Establishing thresholds and targets goals. Treatment, again, using kind of those 4 pillars, using a variety of methods that are going to be appropriate for the weed, the site, and the life cycle of the plant. So those, of course, include mechanical or manual, so mowing, pulling, cultural, burning, covering, for example, biological and chemical. And again, it'll probably be a combination of those things. And then evaluation, always improving, and then the cycle continues. So when we're referring to noxious weeds, of course, we're kind of using that legal definition of noxious weed for harmful non-native invasive species that have been accepted to the Washington State noxious weed list. From there, the Class B and C weeds are selected for control based on the county. But I do want to kind of mention, as we're talking about the lists here, 2 more lists at the state level to be aware of. The first is this first is the monitor list for those plants that we suspect to be invasive, but the state board hasn't yet had enough data or support to list them. And the second is the plant quarantined or prohibited plant list. That list has many noxious weeds on it, as well as plants that haven't yet been introduced to Washington as a preventative measure to keep those plants out of the state in the first place. So I've already mentioned classes. Just kind of wanted to refresh those. These are based on distribution. So those Class A noxious weeds, like egg leaf spurge here in the top photo, these are those that are most limited in distribution. So those are the ones that are only impacting a few counties in Washington State, and in those counties, the I guess infestation level is still pretty low. Eradication is required for those, meaning that all plants need to be removed because that's the most feasible. Class B noxious weeds are those like in the photo here, hybrid or Bohemian knotweed. Those are ones that are pretty limited in some areas and very widespread in others. I know a lot of us here on the west side, see this species in our sleep, but it really hasn't done quite as much on the east side of the state. So control may or may not be required depending on where you are. And then Class C noxious weeds are those that are like Canada thistle here that are essentially everywhere. Control is only required for those species if selected by the County Noxious Weed Board. All right, and I wanted to introduce just a general invasive species curve or general invasion curve. So this has, species introduction. We'll discuss these kind of action thresholds in the next few slides. But I just kind of wanted to take a quick look at this and in an effort to illustrate that after an infestation occurs, we're kind of at a race against time to get to that species before it starts becoming established and eventually spreading. Eventually those plants are spreading and we kind of reach that exponential growth where control costs become very costly and it becomes more established, meaning that it's going to be, again, covering a lot more ground and is going to be a lot harder to, completely eliminate. And then eventually even to control is going to be a challenge. So, of course, the first step, ideally prevention. There's kind of two routes to introduction. So prevention kind of looks at limiting both of those routes. The first is through deliberate planting. So this is, you think of escaped ornamentals, but there have certainly been a lot of really well-intentioned plantings, either for aesthetic value or for other perceived benefits, where these plants have been deliberately planted and have escaped containment. Of course, the prohibited plant list is an effort to try to reduce this. However, the prohibited plant list can't necessarily stop every single landscape ornamental from being traded, or some of those species still entering landscapes and then expanding. Certainly, landscape dumping still happens, especially in kind of wooded areas, natural areas. So that's definitely one route to be aware of. The other route is through accidental plantings. So that's pretty common when materials, dirt, gravel, hay, are moved from a site that is infested to a site that's not infested. If there's seed or other propagated plant materials in that, then it can very quickly establish to the new site. Another thing for our groups to be aware of is gear and equipment. Mowers, boots. We'll discuss a couple of species today that can spread very effectively through just a pretty small amount of mud on gear or equipment. So kind of a best practice to get into, especially if you're working in areas that some of these species are present in, is to, brush your boots and gear, get off any big chunks of mud before getting in the truck, before leaving the site. And for equipment, hosing it down in an area that it won't be introduced to a new site. And for boats, remembering to clean, drain, dry. So once an infestation has happened, this is kind of the point where a new plant has emerged at a new site. Eradication is feasible. And what we mean by that is the complete elimination of the noxious weed from that area. Again, this is not going to be appropriate for all noxious weeds. Some species that have become too established, eradication is going to be way too resource intensive to be successful. And, kind of at that point, our goal switches to containment or control. Eradication, though, is certainly a cost-saving measure, because if we're able to get to it early and completely eliminate it, then that's one more species that we don't have to be going back to year after year. However, I do want to mention that a pretty hefty monitoring program is still required even after eradication may be achieved. In this photo here, we have a couple of our 2023 seasonal noxious weed aids assisting with a survey of an eradicated site. For this particular project, it's Spartina control, and our project defines eradication as 6 negative surveys over at least 3 years. But we still revisit these sites since there are still plants that could return from other sites in the county and the greater Puget Sound area. And then kind of the next level of infestation, containment or control, is the appropriate action. What we mean by containment or control is to stop it from spreading. This is to protect those areas that haven't yet become infested and to create space to protect those resources, such as riparian areas, infrastructure, and other kind of crucial areas. Again, this is going to be for weeds that are most recently infested. That heightened requirement of eradication is more appropriate because it'll, essentially be a cost-saving measure down the line. But for those species that haven't yet become so widespread all over the place, containment or control is required to essentially protect those unfested areas and to, protect those assets that are in those areas. Kind of the next step following containment or control is long-term management. Think species like Himalayan blackberry that feel like they're all over the place, that we will never have, completely eliminated from an area, but that we do need to address and, carve out space for those important ecosystems in our riparian restoration projects to protect, personal property and to protect infrastructure like roads, including roadside visibility and safety. So early detection and rapid response, again, is a coordinated set of actions that's essentially part monitoring and finding these species and part contingency plans for what happens if we do find them. EDRR is, I guess, not a replacement for an integrated weed management plan, but ideally is part of your weed management plan. And I know that sometimes these acronyms can sound very expensive. Ideally, it's, just kind of a way of being a little bit more prepared in your integrated weed management plan. A lot of these steps that we're going to talk about, your agencies or organizations are already doing. Just with, a few more resources and trainings, we can, really save a lot of costs in identifying some of these key species early and being able to kind of plan and act quickly to reduce them, hopefully eradicating them, or at least containing them to specific areas. So, of course, preparedness is going to be a step present in each of these components of early detection and rapid response. Looking here at this screenshot map, this is a screenshot from the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, edmaps.org, for flowering rush. This is a species that we'll talk about in a few slides here. Essentially, another great resource if you're looking at kind of the planning and analyzing risk side of things is the WSDA's distribution maps. This can kind of help you understand where these species are. I think this EdMaps is a great resource because you can kind of see where they're being spotted. And kind of over time, you can notice some species creeping west. This species is definitely one of those, is now kind of becoming established in the Columbia River watershed and has a CWMA group there now, or cooperative weed management area there now. Is also present in Whatcom County. Looking at this particular species, is spread by plant material. This kind of sets off a little bit of a red flag in my mind, since I know that Silver Lake has a public boat launch, and several of our lakes also have public boat launches. We may see this species within the next decade, and should be prepared to see it and to act quickly if we do. At the preparedness step, we can be inventorying the tools and resources that are available to us, and those that we can leverage very quickly if we do spy a new species emerging in our areas, and in early detection. So monitoring is a big part of this. Again, a lot of your organizations are already doing this monitoring step, especially if you have stewards or stewardship visits. As long as the people going out to the site are trained and able to identify new and emerging species and are able to collect data and report and verify what they're finding. So if you have protocols already for collecting via field maps, iForm, other apps, that's great. If not, I'd love to help you get connected to EdMaps, a free citizen science-based app that can help those doing the surveys collect, photos, other crucial data to be able to verify that what they have found is in fact the species that they think it is, and then can help kind of share that with other land managers. The next step is rapid assessment. So again, kind of communication, coordination. This is kind of the point where we use that data that we've now collected to plan the appropriate response. At this stage, we're going to be assessing whether we're going to need to get a hold of additional funds or permits if we need to reach out to landowners in the area. And then, of course, a rapid response. So prioritize actions that you can take quickly and that will be appropriate for the site and the life stage. We'll discuss this photo in the example in this photo a bit more at the end. But I just kind of wanted to point out that when this plant was identified it was bolting, which means that herbicide was no longer an option, and we were kind of at a race against time to get a hold of these species before those seed hit the seed bank. The Skagit Land Trust was able to motivate and kind of gather their volunteers in the area very quickly to collect those that were bolting, so that, saving all those seeds from escaping. And then, of course, your rapid response should be sustainable because, again, integrated weed management is never really a one and done. So we'll need to, kind of assess if you're able to continue and sustain this level of labor at the site, if we need to create kind of a slightly different plan, depending on the resources and follow-up that'll be available. Also, again, just to kind of mention that reports and communication, coordination with partners is a great idea, especially to help ensure that the torch doesn't get dropped on eradication in a new infestation like this. So I have a short list of species here that I've kind of highlighted as some EDRR species in the riparian areas in the Skagit River watershed. Some of these are already present in the area, others are not yet. And I, kind of want to stress that this is not an extensive list and I don't have a crystal ball. So we could certainly see other species coming in the near future. So if you suspect that you're seeing a novel noxious weed, or just one that you aren't sure how to address, I'm happy to collaborate and I encourage you to reach out. Our first species here, garlic mustard. I have mentioned it a couple times, but this is one that is present in Skagit County. We know of essentially two populations. This is a very high priority to eradicate. It's a biennial plant. So in its first year, it'll look like a rosette. Or it'll be in its rosette stage. It has these kind of kidney-shaped leaves with rough edges, green to black stems. And if you pull it up, you'll see a white taproot that kind of has an L or S shape. In its second year, it will bolt and get these kind of more spade-shaped leaves. It'll have that stereotypical cruciferous, 4-petal cross-shaped flower and seed pods. There are a couple of lookalike species that I want to mention. Native plants, ground ivy looks a lot like it. It'll have, runners along the ground. But piggyback plant and fringe cup, I've also seen misidentified for it. And those are awesome native plants. So we want to make sure not to accidentally get those in the crossfire. As I'd mentioned kind of earlier, garlic mustard has an allelopathic chemical which helps it, helps give it a leg up on the competition, helps it quickly take over a forest floor. And again, this is a species that you're going to find in forest understory, so partial to dense canopy. It really can't be shaded out. If you're finding small infestations, you could certainly hand pull it. You'll just want to make sure to bag it so that any seed heads on it don't get the chance to hit the ground. And if you're finding a larger area, if you're able to get to it while it's in this rosette stage or even better seedling stage, you could use a glyphosate-based herbicide and follow up. This part's really crucial to follow up to hand pull any that make it to flowering because it's not unlikely that some will get by you. This is kind of only known in two areas in Skagit County right now, one off of South Skagit Highway and one just south of Cedar Woolley. So if you're working in these areas, I would highly recommend, please be very careful about moving equipment and gear on and off the site. Just kind of getting in the habit of cleaning our boots and cleaning our equipment before getting to new sites will really, really help us with this species. I also wanted to mention in Skagit County, we have received a small grant from the state, so we're able to offer a little bit of assistance to landowners kind of struggling with this species that we can find in the next year here. The next species is giant hogweed. This is another Class A noxious weed that is currently present in Skagit County. It's toxic to humans and some animals. Kind of a greater concern than its toxicity, though, is the phototoxic sap. This is that one that you see the horrible burns and blisters. It causes extreme sensitivity to light, but it's equally concerning to the environment. It grows in these riparian areas and is just an early grower and takes up a huge amount of space. It's very competitive and, really makes native plants more sparse. This increases soil erosion, which, just again, monopolizing that space gets worse and worse. This is a sometimes biennial, but mainly perennial in our area. Spreads primarily by seed, but also vegetatively. So if you're finding the species, we're needing to address both the seeds and the root of the plant. Small plants can be dug up if that's feasible. If you're finding it at the rosette stage or kind of this vegetative stage, foliar herbicide treatments are certainly effective. If you're finding it at this bolt stage, the primary thing is going to be controlling those flowering heads, keeping it from going to seed. If it's too large to be doing foliar spray, injection and cut stump have also been effective. So I would encourage you to reach out to your noxious weed control board or me to kind of brainstorm some ideas that will be appropriate for that particular plant. I do want to mention too that there are some lookalikes for giant hogweed, primarily cow parsnip. This is also a phototoxic plant, so it would be a good idea to have sleeves and gloves anytime you're handling a plant that looks like this. I've also seen Devil's Club and Western Coltsfoot misidentified as giant hogweed, but those will have simple palmate leaves, where cow parsnip and giant hogweed will have that dissected leaf. So that's kind of a good way to tell. Again, cow parsnip and giant hogweed can be really difficult to differentiate from each other. The primary ways to tell them apart are the size. Giant hogweed is going to cap out at 8 to 20 feet, which is a very large plant, and cow parsnip will be between 3 and 7 feet. The leaves will also be a lot more serrated or deeply toothed compared to cow parsnip, but I'll be honest with you, I can convince myself that any cow parsnip is giant hogweed if I look at it for long enough. So my cheat is to keep a photo of both on my phone and compare and contrast to each other to know which one I have for sure. This is another species that we only knew of 2 populations, one on Fidalgo Island and one just kind of south of Sedro-Woolley. So especially if you're in those areas, you may see it, but that can certainly pop up in other areas in the watershed as well. Eggleaf spurge, another class A noxious weed that is found in Skagit County, but is very uncommon. This is an upright perennial that stands about 3 feet tall. It has egg-shaped leaves. However, I think that the leaves are more oblong than they are egg-shaped, but it certainly is more egg-shaped than its close relative leafy spurge. Both are class A, or one is class B, but both are very uncommon in Skagit County. So we definitely want to find and control, actually eradicate both if any are found. These are very toxic to humans and animals. They have a kind of a milky white sap that can be very irritating to the skin. So again, you want to be handling this plant with gloves and sleeves on. For eggleaf or leafy spurge, if you find a small infestation, you could dig it up. Pulling it won't be effective since it is perennial. There are chemical options that will work against it, but if it's a large infestation, we'll probably need to do a combination of tilling or mowing and then spraying new growth. Again, chemical options can be kind of limited depending on what type of site you're on. So this would be a great one to reach out to your weed board to brainstorm kind of the best path forward. In Skagit County, again, this is known in 2 areas, one on Fidalgo Island and one West Mount Vernon. However, I have seen reports of eggleaf spurge also up around Diablo, so it could be within the Skagit River system. This next plant, flowering rush, is one that is a class A noxious weed, not yet present in Skagit County. I hope it is never present in Skagit County. But this is one that thrives in lakes and slow-moving freshwater streams. It sounds like it's extremely difficult to control, so it's one that I really want to prioritize early detection on. It can grow emergent or submerged in water up to, I've seen reports of 6 to 9 feet. It has triangular leaves, which can be a little bit tricky since, we have a lot of sedges that will be growing in kind of a similar area. This will be a lot more triangular shaped stem cross section than a lot of our native sedges will be. They'll be a lot more flat. If you're able to dig them up, they also will have kind of a rhizomal root masses. I guess the easiest way to identify it is probably by its flowers. However, they don't flower very often, only for a part of the year. And the species that's growing in Whatcom County is considered, the sterile triploid version. So they'll be flowering even less frequently. So we likely can't rely on that. They, kind of are perennial. They spread by roots and create monotypic shoreline habitat that is pretty destructive for, of course, those that use the shoreline habitat. Hairy willow herb. This is going to look very similar to fireweed. Let's see, I've got fireweed to compare it to. Fireweed will mainly be flowering just on the terminal end, where hairy willow herb will be kind of interspersed with leaves. Fireweed will have alternate leaves, and hairy willow herb will be opposite. Currently, it's only known on Fidalgo Island in Skagit County, but it is in surrounding counties and could certainly be within the Skagit River system. And finally, common reed. This is another one that we don't yet know of in Skagit County, but that is in surrounding areas and certainly could come up. It's a perennial that kind of creates large clonal areas of this grass. It has kind of plume-like flower structures like pampas grass, but instead of, kind of the thin grass blades that pampas grass does, it has more of a reed-like structure with those really wide leaf blades. There is a native variety of common reed. So if you suspect that you're seeing it, it'd be a great idea to reach out, although the native variety is very uncommon. And then just kind of to wrap up, wanted to share a story. This is definitely not the only example of early detection and rapid response that we've had recently here in Skagit County. So when I stepped into my role in late fall of 22, we'd kind of been looking at maps and trying to identify some of those sites where our high priority species are present. One of those species, of course, was garlic mustard on the South Skagit Highway. We'd gone out and done some initial survey, and I'd looked at some of the lands that were potentially impacted in the area. I reached out to Kayla Seaforth with the Skagit Land Trust and kind of wanted to give her a shout out. We had gotten together and did kind of a practice survey. I'd collected some samples so that she could get the hang of identifying them and kind of seeing them. We discussed kind of where we could expect to see it growing and what to do if we ever do find it. We didn't find any in our practice survey, but that was not the last time that Kayla saw this plant. So within the month, Kayla was out at another site and spotted garlic mustard. Again, the garlic mustard that she found was bolting at that time, so herbicide was no longer a tool available to us. And I kind of wanted to just share this example because it was a great example of preparedness. She'd been out doing these stewardship visits in the area. She knew what she was looking for and very quickly reached out to confirm that that's what she had identified and to kind of brainstorm a plan. She knew that she had an awesome volunteer base to reach out to and was able to mobilize them to collect a large amount of, clearly demonstrated by those bags, a large amount of bolting garlic mustard that would have dumped a lot of seed into the soil. So certainly well demonstrated preparedness, early detection, rapid assessment, and rapid response. And we were able to offer some assistance in reaching out to landowners, technical assistance, and we're able to obtain a small amount of funding to help landowners in that area get connected to resources that they need to apply the level of control needed to eradicate this population. So, and that's all I've got. I have my contact information here as well as our website. Thank you for your time and attention. And again, if you're dealing with any novel species or species that you're not sure quite how to address, or would like making kind of contingency plans for what to do if we find these weeds in our area, I would love to help. Okay, so we've got, would you be able to list the resources you mentioned on the integrated weed management slide? Yeah, certainly. I can everybody see chat if I type it there? I've been curious at the effectiveness of the boot brushes that are available at trailheads of some hikes. Do you happen to know how much those get used, and if they have been useful in limiting invasives on the trail? Is there any worry that boots would pick up and spread invasives from that brush, since theoretically that has seeds on and around it? So I should have probably collected some of that that data before coming in here, but there have been some studies that kind of do highlight their effectiveness and I guess justify the cost. I know I've spoken again. Laurel, I'm calling you out a couple times because most of my weedy wisdom comes from you. It seems like that as long as those boot brush are being maintained, they get used. That if they are pretty dirty and gross, they don't get used so much. Also, ideally, they'll be clean. The idea is that you're leaving behind the dirt that would be carrying as much as there are very small seeds. If you're getting rid of the kind of chunks of mud and dirt, those are really what's harboring a lot of seeds. So as long as those boot brushes are getting cleaned out every once in a while, they work pretty well. And then kind of the other nice thing is that if anything does end up getting established, it's going to be there where someone's going to be kind of constantly visiting. Did that map just show garlic mustard in the Sauk River, Skagit River Delta? There is garlic mustard on kind of within the Skagit River floodplain. It's not, kind of within the aquatic area, but it is certainly within the Skagit River floodplain, unfortunately. I see cow parsnip can also have red coloration, especially in sunny exposed site, but the pattern is a little different. Yes, I know that little identification guide has kind of calls out that red coloration. I think that's a little bit less reliable, since it can, cow parsnip can be red, can have some red coloration on the stems. So I don't think that's quite as helpful of an identification tool. We found a single stalk up in New Halem over the summer, giant hogweed. Yeah, that is really disappointing to hear, but that is a species that really thrives in riparian areas. I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, I'm sorry. Great question. Why is herbicide no longer an option once the plant is bolting? So for biennials like garlic mustard, or I guess some other, maybe the biennials are kind of the main one that we refer to as bolting. Once they're bolting, essentially they are going to seed and then they're dying anyway. So if you're spraying them at the point where they're already flowering, it's essentially kind of doing what the plant is already going to be doing, kind of getting to them when they are in that rosette stage. Essentially it has the time to work and to kill the plant before it has the chance to set seed. Essentially, you need a little bit of time for that herbicide to be effective. It's not as effective when the plant isn't growing and moving sugars around. And so it's essentially just, kind of targeting it at a life stage where it's already kind of past the point where killing it is going to be an option. Nice success story. Thank you for sharing the knowledge. Yeah, I know that, again, that's certainly not the only EDRR success story in the area, but I thought that was a great example. And I'm sorry that Kayla wasn't able to share it with us today, but I really, want to give her and her team kudos.
Our next presenter is Bengt Miller, who's going to talk about knotweed control in the Upper Skagit Watershed. Bengt is currently the stewardship coordinator with the Skagit Fishery Enhancement Group, who he's worked with since 2010, doing all manner of salmon restoration work, from riparian enhancements to in-stream projects to monitoring and education and outreach. He strives to continually learn about restoration while constantly being amazed by the wonder of the Pacific Northwest.
Thank you so much for that intro. I appreciate it a ton. I'm going to keep my video off because I was having bandwidth issues earlier and getting booted out. So hopefully that will not be the case during this presentation. I'm going to talk to you about a large-scale knotweed control project in the Skagit Watershed that I managed for the Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group. The program was created by initiated and created by the Nature Conservancy in the early 2000s in response to the Chinook Recovery Plan, which was put in place. And in that, it listed invasive species as a limiting factor affecting juvenile Chinook production. So the theory was, if you can get rid of some of the invasive species, specifically some of the more threatening ones, you will increase Chinook production. The program, when it was initiated by the Nature Conservancy, decided to take a top-down watershed approach in a landscape scale. Instead of just being not just about the watershed, it was a much more watershed approach, and sort of use the physiology of knotweed as one of the driving forces in its control. I'm not going to get much into, the threat knotweed poses. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but it is a plant that spreads largely vegetatively, and because it's a riparian plant, that means generally in flood that spreads from upstream patches downstream by plant fragmentation, either of the plant itself or the rhizomes underground. Any sort of control effort needs to address the uppermost patches of the watershed first. And the thought was at the time, if you start in the upper watershed and you just eventually eliminate those patches, work your way downstream, treating as you go, and eventually you will have eliminated the plant from the watershed. This sounds great in theory. So the Skagit CWMA, which is a cooperative weed management area, which is sort of a gathering of organizations, entities, municipalities concerned about knotweed in the Skagit watershed, decided to take a sub-watershed tiered management approach, meaning the larger Skagit watershed was broken up into sub-watersheds. And then each of those sub-watersheds was given a classification of either, clean, which meant there was no knotweed present, eradication, which meant theoretically knotweed could be gotten rid of from that watershed, and management, which meant knotweed was present within that watershed, and eradication is the end goal, but it seems unlikely in that sub-watershed due to any number of factors. In the early days when the Nature Conservancy had the program, it was sort of a scattershot approach. They would find some source of funding. They would hire a WCC crew seasonally during the summers, generally in the short term for whatever funding they had. And they would go out into these, following this tiered watershed top-down approach and try to treat knotweed. The initial thought was, we'll see some knotweed, we'll treat it, we'll move on, and we'll get the whole watershed that way. Initially, the documentation was sort of inconsistent and sporadic because there was not a lot of thought given to repeating the process in subsequent years. Data management back in the original days was what was required to report herbicide treatments to the agencies, either funding the work or, WSDA or DOE for any herbicide application close to water. As the program continued, the methods and the processes evolved to the point where more metrics started being recorded so that progress could be shown over time. Things like stem counts, area measurements of patches, and then it eventually evolved to like identifying each individual patch of knotweed hanging flagging so that it could be found in subsequent years, taking a GPS point on it, going back to that patch year after year to monitor it and treat it if necessary. And then the program made a huge leap forward in pretty early on when one of the people working for the program was just at a bar in Skagit talking to someone sitting next to them at the bar stool. And they're like, "What do you do?" And they started describing the program, and that person was like, "Well, I'm a raft guide, and I totally support what you guys are doing. I think this plant is a huge pest in the watershed. I think it would be great to get you all out on a raft and we can do some treatments from the water." And from then on, that has been one of the main modes of transportation and treatment. So, early on, the program has evolved and progress was being made. In 2010, Skagit Fisheries inherited the Knotweed program from the Nature Conservancy. I believe they sort of shifted their focus more from upriver Skagit stuff to estuarian areas, and they were looking to offload the program, was looking for a place to home it. And Skagit Fisheries ended up being a wonderful place for that, because at the same time as that was happening with the Nature Conservancy, Scalise Light decided that they owned enough property in the Skagit that they wanted somebody to sort of steward and keep track of that land on the ground. And they came to Skagit Fisheries, and we were like, we have the local knowledge to be able to do that with them. So Skagit Fisheries is able to create this position within our organization that works on knotweed roughly half the time and on SCL conservation properties the other half the time. We've been fortunate to be able to continue running the program continually since 2010. As you can see by the number of on-the-ground field days on the years, the level of effort has fluctuated a bunch. Almost all this is dictated by available funding. It would be great to have one source of funding that we could go back to consistently, but that has not been the case. We are always seeking opportunities and grant funds to do this knotweed control work in the watershed. And I will touch on that a little bit later. And then 2011 also marked a huge turning point in the program. The Soxhawtl tribe, which had been participating in the cooperative weed management area meetings, decided to initiate some on-the-ground control work. They sort of started a little bit smaller, working and taking over some of the watershed from Skagit Fisheries and working in the sort of the lower Sauk section. And it's been a wonderful partnership and cooperation with that tribe since then. And as our program has struggled to find funding, they have managed to continue to thrive and have expanded their treatment area and now fill in the gaps if there's certain parts of the watershed that Skagit Fisheries is not able to get to. So kudos to the Soxhawtl tribe and partnership and coordination and working together. And I will touch on that more a little bit later. By 2017, we decided that we'd seen a large enough decline in knotweed in the upper Skagit watershed that we decided to see if we could gather the resources and expand the program area downstream, because the overall lifetime goal is to get the whole watershed covered. And we had been working in just the upper parts above the confluence in Rockport since the program initiated. So we decided to see if we could, what kind of resources, and do an assessment on the feasibility of expanding that treatment area downstream. We were fortunate enough to get a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Pulling Together initiative that allowed us to do this. We decided that the easiest way to do an assessment would be to raft that section of river with a couple of handheld GPSs and just take points wherever we saw knotweed along the riverbank. We were able to do this in 2 trips, one with an Earth Corps crew from Seattle who came up, and one with a couple of volunteers from Phillips 66, since it was their funding that they had contributed to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The initial thought was that we would be able to, so the original project area is outlined in red here. It's sort of upstream from Rockport up to Skagit and Sauk. Our initial thought was that we would expand 21 miles downstream to tie in with some work that Skagit County had been doing along Grandy Creek for a number of years at this point. It would kind of make a nice tidy package, and it would continue to follow that sort of top-down approach and the sub-watershed method, which we had been following all along. If we did move to that confluence, it would include 6 sub-watersheds and 21 main stem miles of river. Well, after those reconnaissance rafting float trips, we realized the scale of the infestation was immense, which we sort of anticipated. I just don't think we knew how large it actually was. Because in those 2 raft trips, we GPSed over 1,000 knotweed patches, varying in size from football fields down to like 1 or 2 stems. And that was all from the rafts. It didn't include surveys like into the floodplain at all, into the upland areas, up any small tributaries or anything. So when we brought this information to the annual CWMA meeting, it was, and there's just a heat map where all those infestations are. When we brought this to the CWMA, it was decided that maybe we were a little overly ambitious and to scale back our intentions a little bit and bite off something much more manageable that we could actually commit resources to and it would have the capacity to deal with. So we decided to just expand 10 miles downstream, which got us, 1 sub-watershed and another length of the Skagit River. That seems to have been the right decision because we are able to do treatments in that middle Skagit reach is what, still far up the Skagit, but we call it the middle Skagit reach. So we're able to still do treatments in there and do the upper watershed. So we have not taken resources away from the upper watershed where knotweed is still present. At the same time that we decided to do this expansion, we worked with the Skagit CWMA to see if we wanted to reclassify any of these sub-watersheds in the basin based on now 8, 9, 10 years of experience. Based on people's backgrounds and knowledge, we decided that we could reclassify all the sub-basins that you see outlined here in pink. A lot of the ones in the upper Skagit control had gone better than expected, so we reclassified those from managed knotweed to eventual eradication. And we're making great headway towards that. We know where all the infestations are at this point, and now we're just trying to treat them to get rid of them. There was sort of a little backstep in the upper Sauk reaches. Because much of that is public land, I think the Skagit CWMA had initially decided that we could eradicate knotweed from those watersheds because we had access to it all and we would just go out there and treat it when we found it. Unfortunately, while it is public, the upper Sauk watershed is a very dynamic rate, but that river is in a different place every year and it spreads throughout the floodplain and just spreads knotweed everywhere. Change that classification to manage from eradicate, even though we are still able to go out there and do treatments. At this point, eradication just seems, maybe that's the extra long-term goal, but for the time being, we just want to manage it in that upper Sauk area and prevent it from spreading further downstream and infesting areas where we are also doing treatment. So let's get into sort of how the on-the-ground actual survey works. What we do before the season starts is assemble all the known knotweed points from all the years gone by, and at this point it is probably about 3,000 points, give or take. We overlay those over an aerial photo and go out and try to find as many of those points as we can from the past, especially the ones that were treated last year, because that's where our monitoring and efficacy data comes from. So we take out the field maps, the crew, and go out to a site, and hopefully it's what it looks like in the photo. A lot of times that is not the case, especially on the Sauk, as you can see in this photo. In the aerial photo, the river is, kind of in the upper right corner of the picture. When we went out to the actual site, the river had avulsed and was now flowing through the woods, which meant we had to adaptively manage our plan for the day and our overall access to the site. But that is par for the course, and anyone that does enough field work knows that these are just situations you deal with. I'm fairly old school and kind of a Luddite, so I still prefer the notebook, pen and pencil approach. I realize the world is moving forward digitally, so we have started to integrate some digital data collection into the Knotweed program. At this point, I don't trust it fully, probably more user error than the actual digital stuff itself. But at this point, we are collecting at pen and paper old school and digitally, because there has been some inconsistencies between the digital data and the pen and paper method. So once those get ironed out, I think we will move more towards this digital data collection. We use, I guess it's field maps at this point for a lot of the mapping stuff that you can see. It's great to try to, navigate to pre-existing knotweed points. And for the database management, we use a program called iForm, which was recommended by the Washington State Department of Ag, because that's what they use, and it integrates well with a lot of different data management software. Once you have all the equipment assembled that you need, we take it out into the field, and generally we're away from the truck for the majority of the day, just walking around the floodplain as much as we can, and up tributaries and side channels and back eddies and everything. So we need to have all the equipment with us that we need for the day for surveying and treatment. We found that having two backpacks helped. One is for all the survey equipment and data collection, and then the other bag is for if any herbicide application is to be done, we use a dry bag for that, just to prevent that stuff from getting into the watershed. And within the survey bag is a checklist of everything that you need in that bag, because once you leave the truck, you're done from it. It's hard to get back to it during the day if you've forgotten something. So then getting out to what is a fairly remote watershed, there's a lot of driving involved to get up there. There's a whole lot of bushwhacking. It turns out, going back old school, before we had roads and interstates, the rivers were the main route of transportation, for millennia, and that is generally still the case. The rafts work great in some of the upper watershed where there's a little bit of white water. The water is fairly shallow. You can't necessarily navigate a boat with an engine or a motor through it. So the rafts are great. You just got to be careful because they don't go upstream at all. You have to be very cognizant of where you're trying to get to, because if you overshoot it, then you're past it for the day. Skagit County has been very cooperative and helpful, and they have a jet boat they have taken us out to some knotweed sites on, and that's super helpful. But again, a lot of it is, the old school method of just getting out there, getting dirty, getting wet, and getting to the site and doing it. Once you're on site, the method generally is if forming a survey line, and you just start walking transects through the floodplain at whatever spacing the conditions sort of call for. If it's a pretty wide open gravel bar, that transect line can be hundreds of feet wide. If you're going through some super dense willows along a gravel bar, you may only be like 10 to 15 feet away from someone. And what you're doing is trying to walk in a line, looking for blue and white flagging or for knotweed itself. The blue and white flagging means, knotweed has been there in the past, and the knotweed itself means there's knotweed that needs to be treated, obviously. At this point, when a patch of knotweed is encountered, the data collection begins. And each patch is given a unique identifier so that it can be found in the past. And then a bunch of metrics are taken on it, like the stem count and the area, a location, GPS point. We also hang that blue and white stripe flagging, as you can see in this picture, and take a photo of that patch. And then record any sort of herbicide data that was used. That gets us to last year. And again, I'm very appreciative to the Skagit CWMA. They've been a great organization. Everyone in there is very active and helpful, and I appreciate a ton how involved they are. As you can see from this sort of map of the upper Skagit watershed, SFEG got funding to do treatments in the areas outlined in pink on the right side here, on the right side here. And then the talks about that was able to do knotweed treatment on this lower section of Sauk and this middle section of the Skagit, which meant that since the whole watershed was covered, then Skagit Fisheries could pick up and do this little section down here, which is where the large knotweed infestation is, in the middle Skagit. And we were able to able to get funds to do that treatment because other CWMA partners had committed to doing the rest of the watershed. So the whole watershed was covered, and we weren't doing treatments downstream of where nothing had been done, which is great. Not going to get too much into the details of year by year, but this past year in 2023, we were able to survey and treat knotweed along 34 miles of Skagit River and tributaries, and we traversed roughly 4,600 acres, looking for knotweed within the watershed. Over the course of the program, like I said, we have been very fortunate that we have been able to continually fund it with grants that are available. The Washington State Department of Ag has been a huge resource. I appreciate them a ton. They get money with every state biannual budget that is specifically dedicated to knotweed control that they then distribute to various organizations throughout the state. That's a huge help because, number one, it's non-federal funds, and number two, they don't require a match, which means those WSDA funds can be leveraged as match to so many other agencies, and it's a necessary resource to provide. It's absolutely wonderful. So in the past, we've gotten grants from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, their partners with the Fish and Wildlife Program. The National Forest Foundation was one that we got 2 years ago through their matching awards program, which is a great resource for if you can meet half the match requirements. It's a great resource to do work on Forest Service lands. The Resource Advisory Committee of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest has been funding the program for years. It's wonderful that they're involved. I appreciate their dedication to working with the CWMA and to doing work within the Skagit watershed, both mostly on Forest Service lands, but because there is the wild and scenic corridor along much of the Skagit and various tributaries, that's also a huge resource. And then the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has been a go-to source for a number of years for funding through their Pulling Together initiative, their 5-star and urban waters restoration program, and most recently the America the Beautiful Challenge. And then before I started EcoTrust, it sounds like funded the program very early on and allowed us to build the foundation from which a lot of this program is built now. The short-term outlook is bright. We have sufficient funding through 2025, both from the Washington State Department of Ag and the America the Beautiful Challenge. When that expires, we'll be back to where we always are, which is scrambling to try to find funding to do weed treatments in an area where we have done weed treatments for years in the past. It's sort of one of the ironies of it all is that knotweed treatments in particular require much follow-up, but a lot of agencies are hesitant to kind of sometimes justifiably hesitant to provide funding to do weed treatments year after year on the same plot of land over and over in the same geographic area. We're also sort of struggling with the when do you expand downstream again? It's I feel like we made the right choice when we expanded those 10 miles downstream, but the overall goal of the project is to, keep expanding the program downstream, working in that top-down approach. Right now, we don't have the resources to commit to expanding downstream, but when is that going to happen? And do you just commit to it and then struggle to find the resources? So that's one thing that we sort of always struggle with, because we could move downstream, but that would probably, at this point, that would be at the expense of the upper watershed, and then that would fly in the face of that top-down approach, and you end up sort of chasing your tail. The very long term, biological controls are on the horizon. I can't speak to a whole lot about that. I know Jennifer Andreas from Washington, WSU Extension, I believe, is going to present at the next Skagit CWMA meeting, which is on January 30th. So those of you interested maybe want to think about attending that. And drone technologies have come so far so fast. There's presumably ways to integrate that into knotweed control. I have not looked at that much. Like I said, I'm kind of a Luddite. I think the opportunity there there's a potential huge upside there. I don't know what that is. I'm looking forward to Daniel Zimmerman's talk on that to see what kind of capabilities are out there presently and where it could go in the future. That is all I have. I feel like I've talked a fair bit. I'm sure there will be many questions. I will do my best to answer as many of them as I can. Thank you for sharing your experiences. The data you collect for knotweed surveys specific to the grant you received, stem counts sound pretty time consuming. Yes and yes. We keep a running database of all the knotweed data that we have sort of in one large cumbersome GIS shapefile. Again, not super technical. I do my best to try to get useful information from that, but a lot of times we report what we're required to for the granting agency during that specific timeline, but we keep all that data going past. And stem counts they're time consuming. I agree, but it's one of the few metrics that I feel like is helpful. It's also, probably not as scientific as it could be, because if it's anything over probably 25, it starts to become an estimate, because we're going to take the time to count out like 7,482 stems. But I do feel like it is still it is a metric that can be used to show progress. If your program had access to increase in regular funding, how would you adapt? That's a great question. I feel like we would either expand downstream or continue to do more intense surveys in the areas in which we are doing them. I think, we use a WCC crew seasonally. I mean, to do this, if we were kind of pie in the sky funding, we could probably bring on another WCC crew or hire seasonal folks that were willing to commit to a life outside in the summer. And that would just allow that much more coverage within the watershed. Great to see this approach and results. In 2023, what was the SFEG level of effort in terms of number of days and number of people? In 2023, we were able to do 41 days in the field with a Washington Conservation Corps crew of 5 and their supervisor. And that, I feel like that is about the extent of what you can do for a field season. If you start too early in the season, you can do surveys, but the herbicide treatments are not super effective. The later you can get in the season, the more effective the herbicide is. But also you run into that time constraint of not being able to cover enough ground. So, for 41 days is about the max that I would recommend. Unfortunately, the way to sort of increase this capacity would be to have more than one crew out doing surveys and treatments, but then you run in, then it just starts to cascade and snowball, and you have to be able to have all the supplies and equipment for a second crew and the coordination of that crew. So it's doable. But at this point, we're not ready to move that way yet. What app program do you use to collect field data, and is it done on a phone, tablet, GPS? So we used to collect it on a handheld. We used to collect a lot of the data, GPS points, on a handheld Garmin unit and write all the data down in notebooks. Now that we're trying to go digital, we use a couple of mini iPads, and on there we have field maps for a lot of the mapping stuff and iForm for the database management, field collection of the data. How might changes in Cial-Salite Dam operations affect Skagit River exotic weeds? Oh, I don't know that I want to wade into that morass. I will let, I think, the policy people deal with that one a little more than me. I am a on-the-ground field guy who deals with the problems in front of him and the weeds that he can see. That policy level stuff is for people much smarter than I, for sure. Can you briefly describe your current knotweed treatment BMPs in regards to herbicides, cut spray versus inject, new patches versus follow-up treatments? We generally do a foliar application using, in the upper Skagit, it's gotten to the point where we can use like a 50-ounce handheld sprayer much of the time. In that middle section where we've only been doing treatment for a couple of years, we bring out the backpack sprayers. Our preferred method is foliar application. We prefer to do a 1% Imazapry mixture in that. It gets a little complicated because certain landowners have different varying requirements, so sometimes you have to change it up. But following Tim Miller's knotweed kiddie pool studies, he found that mixture was the most effective versus any sort of Imazapry glyphosate mixture. Generally, it's not quite as effective, and leads the next year can lead to that epinastic growth that everyone seems to see periodically. We have done some injection in the past. Generally, if a landowner is concerned about drift onto something else on their property, we'll do an injection. The only time I've done some cut applications is when a landowner has cut down the knotweed before I get out there, and then I dribble some herbicide into those cut stems. New patches versus follow-up treatments. Generally, it's been my experience, and I know this varies widely, and I'd love to have a larger discussion about this sometime. It seems like rarely is one application of herbicide to a knotweed patch enough to kill it indefinitely. It generally, I feel like, knocks it back roughly 80%, give or take, that first year. And then after that, in follow-up years, you sort of start to see diminishing return. There are some knotweed patches out there that we have been following for years, and every now and then we know it's there and we don't spray it just because there's some evidence out there that holding off for a year or two and then applying herbicide subsequently actually allows it to uptake and may have a more beneficial impact than applying knotweed to the same patch for a decade straight. What herbicide mix are you using for treatment, and how many years do you have to treat the same patch until it's gone? We're planning a similar project to eradicate knotweed from a subbasin in the Chehalis. Oh man, this is a topic that I think everyone that works in this field has some opinion about. I don't know that I've ever seen actual scientific study on how long it takes to get rid of it. But generally, my rule of thumb is plan on 3 years, and it might go slightly longer. And then every now and then you find that patch that you walk past, you don't see it 1 year after you had treated it for 2, and then the next year it pops up and is present again. Hey, Bengt, great talk. I'm interested to hear if your team have considered using eDNA data in your knotweed surveys. I don't know the answer to that because I don't really understand what the question is asking. I apparently lack the scientific background to know how eDNA would be helpful for knotweed surveys, but I would love, Arthur, I would love to get in touch with you sometime after this conference and find out what that is all about for sure. What is your process for orientation in the field to find previously identified knotweed stands in the case of dynamic riparian conditions? A lot of times, if you've been doing it long enough, you sort of become familiar with the site and or become familiar with the watershed. And it's kind of shocking how much of the stuff actually sticks in your brain when you go out there and you can be like, I know there was a patch here last year. It's not here anymore. It washed away. But we also have, like I said, those mini iPads that have the GPS coordinates of those patches on them. We have the little handheld Garmin's, which have those patches on them. So if you're if you're trying to navigate to a specific location and it says it's 150 feet directly in front of you and you run into the river, well, that seems like a pretty good indication that the river has changed course, that patch has potentially washed away. What does date show about effectiveness of treatments? I don't know. We're still struggling with the best way to sort of coalesce that data and show the long-term benefits of it. What we do with it in the short term is report to the granting agencies that we get funds from, and we can, for example, we can be like, we treated this many knotweed stems or this many knotweed patches, and year to year we've seen an 80% eradication rate. So that's what we use the data for. We have this huge database. I don't have the scientific background to sort of do any sort of analysis with it, but it seems like there is opportunity for someone that's comfortable or familiar with R potentially, or some other kind of data analysis software to do something with it and maybe create some sort of predictive model.
Great. So our next presenters are David Heimer and Daniel Zimmerman, and they're going to talk to us about using drones for weed management. David Heimer is Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's Noxious Weed Coordinator, and he oversees weed crews and provides support to wildlife area staff on projects regarding vegetation management and pesticide policy issues. Daniel Zimmerman is the North Puget Sound Weed Crew Supervisor for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he is responsible for Spartina eradication and is also tasked with other vegetation management projects from wetland to shrub steppe across the state. Daniel also spends the winter season as the swan mortality biologist.
So today is not all on drone, but kind of on the story of how we ended up getting or trying to incorporate drones into kind of our veg management plan. So first off, the big thing we're doing is treating non-native cattail. It's the narrow leaf cattail that's pretty much, think of it as a cattail probably thin as a pencil. It's kind of taken over the South Skagit Delta, and it's kind of this high density. It's excluded a lot of open areas. A lot we focus on down there is waterfowl hunting, trying to promote and the waterfowl, as well as keeping open water for some of the fish species that we're all working to kind of help bolster back. Yeah, and this version is a lot more salt tolerant. And then also being the allelopathic, it kind of doesn't help anything else around it, and it just creates these really tall monocultures that you can kind of see in the back. So we kind of started in 2014, and we were using one of these marsh masters, and pretty much was just crushing the cattail. This kind of became obvious that with this amount of air that was in just the stem itself, the stems would float when the tide came back in. So we went and rented one of these things from Louisiana and started mowing it. We ended up doing this for a couple years, but essentially it did knock back some seed set and thinned it out very slightly. But it's essentially like mowing your lawn. It just keeps growing back, and you would pretty much have to do multiple mowings in a season. We started pretty much just off the Skagit wildlife area on the other side of the river with 50 acres, and then we've kind of started to scale up to a couple hundred acres a year as kind of the technology's improved. We now have one of these marsh masters with a big boom system. I believe it's about 40 feet wide, set up with a spray computer that they use in precision agriculture, so it can track pretty much anytime each boom is on. So when you start going back through the tracks and the data, it'll show pretty much the patches that you missed or decided not to hit if there was only a couple stems of cattail and a lot more native vegetation. And that kind of helps bolster some of the seed bank with a lot of the natives. In 2018, we went through because there was a lot of questions on how much there actually was out there on the South Delta. All the blue are patches that were ground truthed. We spent probably 6 weeks with 4 people going around to a lot of these places, and with phones with collector, which is what now field maps, and would pretty much just turn on a track line, walk around a patch, and then submit. Not at first, but after a while, we started going through and guessing how much was cattail. A lot of these marks here are things that are 50% or better. Things that were just a couple stems of cattail weren't included in this survey. So a lot of the challenges we end up going through is we have to leave from kind of up in here and bring them, that marsh master floats down, and we have to bring it all the way out into here to get any of the treatments. All of this dark stuff that you can kind of see here, that's cattail. And that's a lot of time. And with our HPAs, you can only go at certain times. You can only cross channels at a certain distance. And as you'll see here in the next couple of slides, that some of the driftwood makes it real difficult to get into some places. So again, here's some of the equipment issues. Here's us towing it. There are mechanical issues that need to get replaced. Does need to get serviced, and it is kind of expensive and time consuming. Also, you can see, if you don't get a nice little sandbar to go up, you're going up some steep banks and pretty much having to winch yourself up. Here's the wood debris that I was talking about. We've accidentally ended up in this area before we had this imagery, but you can kind of see some of these areas in here. This is all just driftwood that's floated in. And it's essentially like you just took a box of toothpicks and just dumped it on the ground, and those machines do not have the suspension or stamina to go over all that wood. And I mean, it's like you're sitting in a washing machine as you're trying to go over a lot of that stuff. And you do not want to end up losing a track going over this stuff in the field. That just makes your day rough. We ended up hiring a Agra services out of Pasco to come out and do some drone mapping and later do some spraying. So here's them going out, and we took them out in the boat. They set up in 2 spots and took a lot of aerial photography for us. And again, we did it earlier in the spring partially because of that driftwood. So you could be able to go through and be able to map kind of where you can, where you can't go, and be able to see some of the channels, so that when we go through and we can publish that into our field maps as a layer, and then it kind of gives operators, when they're in the Marsh Master, a better like visual of kind of like what's coming, so they're not getting stuck. So this is the whole product they ended up giving us. They ended up doing over 2,000 acres of the Delta. I then took the imagery that they produced and made a bunch of these little yellow areas that you could tell on there, and from surveys we've done before, that was the cattail that we were trying to go after. And then you had to go through and try to figure out landing points, because this drone comes in the trailer. Flight time on some of these spray drones is only like 8 minutes. So you kind of have to pick a bunch of different areas that you can get a landing zone, but also be able to get a boat to carry your chemical or in batteries and people back and forth. After I kind of made these polygons and kind of sent them to the contractor, and then they kind of figured out like what would work best for their equipment. So here's the kind of the trailer they bring. They have all their drones set up in there. They have a massive generator that's running, and a bunch of battery chargers on the outside. And then here's one kind of flying and us filling one up. And then kind of the landing pad that we wondered where one of those pins were. So these are what we ended up getting. This is the Agris T40, the max payload, 110 pounds there, and it is a massive drone at almost, say, 10 foot by 10 foot. Also, you can get a seed spreader with them, which is one thing that I'm kind of excited about, is that after you do a couple years of treatment or a year after, then you can come back in the spring or the winter and spread seed and try to get some of those natives kind of back in there. The little one is our Mavic, which is a multispectral. We use this to do all the mapping, since that one has like 45 minutes of flight time. And we're still trying to figure out how to use the multispectral enough. The thought was that we would be able to go and kind of figure out areas that were 100% of this cattail or whatever plant we're looking for, and kind of target specific, I guess, the lighting or reflection back. We haven't, or at least I haven't been able to kind of like narrow that down enough. Like this, it's not just, doesn't just stick out like black and white. There's a lot of kind of shades of gray that you kind of have to wade through. Here's kind of like the controller for the T40. And this kind of shows like it's more or less kind of playing on a computer little video game, but you can kind of just go in there, you make your polygon on the map, and it has real good aerial mapping. And you can take the mapping too from your this Mavic and in the system on your computer, and then you can like push that imagery to the controller of the spray drone. And then with that, you can kind of modify which way you want to take the routes. And some of the ones that they do with the Mavic is, say, some of the spot spraying. I know the contractor we did just did a presentation on some potato beetles. They could take the Mavic, see where all the vegetation wasn't looking very good. And with that, they go through and they can just make little circles, and the spray drone will just kind of go up to that little spot, start spraying, spin in a circle, go to the next spot, spray in a circle. And so it can hit these smaller areas without just kind of getting all the plants. So here's one of the areas that we've done. You can kind of see where it was sprayed. We also kind of marked areas that we could see where there was native vegetation or areas that we've planted before. that we didn't want hit. And I was really surprised on kind of the straight lines and the ability it has to just say, okay, it just moves out or stops one of the sprayers. So it's not hitting these sites that we want. Overall, the contractor ended up going through and mapping 2,700 acres there. We ended up treating 57 acres of the cattail, and then we did in the previous photo was all Canarygrass. So that was 23 acres, and they got that done in a couple hours. Again, the amount of time this technology or even just those couple days saved us was weeks of trying to use the Marsh Masters. And it's not just the spraying, like getting the Marsh Master and spraying, but it's the logistics of getting the equipment there, the transportation, waiting for the right tides, like just the amount of time that saved us. So you could just kind of, okay, you bring out your water, your chem, you kind of show up, get it done, and then you're gone, instead of having all this large equipment that you're having to move back and forth that can break. A lot of the towing, that was one of the things too with the tides. You got to make sure you got enough to where even the boat can be towing us. It's things to consider when using the drones. It is a new technology. If anyone's ever gone to the DJI website and looking at the drones, their videos are fantastic and looks like it will solve all the world's problems. That is, from what we're hearing and seeing, is not true. They have just a really good marketing team. The one thing that we really struggled with in asking this contractor is kind of all the specific metadata we needed and we were looking for, and it came pretty apparent that they go out there, they do the mapping, they figure out what they need to spray, and they go spray it, and then their job's done. There's a lot of the stuff in the GIS world that they didn't really have down. They were still, I mean, it's a younger company, but they're still kind of trying to figure that out. Also, on our end, we are trying to figure out what we needed from them, and trying to talk to our GIS department, and like the lingo going from the GIS department to us to the contractor. There was just a lot of, it kind of turned into muddy water. Some of the cost too is the cost to host those layers. If you do the mapping, we're learning if you're just doing these big, massive, couple thousand acre maps are pretty expensive to host online so that you can use them later. So luckily, being in a big enough agency, there's enough credits to be able to do that. But that's here and there. We're not going to be able to do this on a yearly basis. And then just the amount of time that we're asking our GIS division to spend with us on top of all their other projects. And this is, again, kind of a newer thing for even them, and just the importing and how to manipulate the data to what they need or what we're trying to get from it. Some of this too, being in the Delta, there's a lot of stuff that these spray drones they're usually spraying 10 feet above the ground. So you actually have to be relatively close to a lot of them, at least so you can keep a line of sight, that's part of the drone licensing, the pilot things. And then also the Mavic, though, that when it's flying up at the max, 400 feet, it's actually pretty amazing how far you can see that out there. I think sometimes we've hit about the 3,800 feet away. So it's about 3/4 mile, somewhere in there, that you can see this away. So you can actually get large chunks of mapping done at once. And then we also figured out too, the equipment to kind of help support. We had probably more people than we needed, but the amount of, again, if these batteries only last 8 minutes of flight time on the spray drones, you have to have a lot of batteries. I think there was times in our boat, we probably had 20 batteries, and they're probably 10, 15 pounds a piece. And it takes 2 batteries in a drone at once. So there was a lot of shuffling back and forth between who's out and how many batteries are out there versus how many we have on the charger. And so there was a lot of logistics of going back and forth. And then again, those nozzles are so fine. We're only spraying, I think we were spraying 3 to 4 gallons an acre when we were doing this. And so you can't be using any water that has any sediment at all. So we were having to transport a lot of water out there. We did, when we were looking at some of the chemicals to use, there was ones that kind of were asking for over the 5 gallons an acre, or ones that like say you could, but it wasn't very specific on some of the aerial applications. And then one of the new things that we have going is the federal legislation going on right now about not the use of Chinese drones, which that would be a bummer since we've only had these ones for the last couple years. And I still don't fully understand what's all going to be in this federal bill. So I guess if anyone's looking at getting a drone, you might want to pay attention to how this goes. I've heard everything of just it can't be made in China to they can't connect to the FAA service, which all the drones, especially when you're using commercially, they have to have a remote ID, which is kind of pings off the FAA server, kind of to let other planes and everything else kind of know who's up in the air and whatever else. And if we can't use that, you're grounded because you can't have that on their signal. So it's not even that it's made in China. It is just that you can't even, you have to have that remote ID going, but you can't have that remote ID going on their server. We'll see how that ends up. And I just learned too here recently, there's even in Washington State, a bill that was being introduced that would also prevent the use of Chinese drones. And I don't know exactly yet. Again, I haven't looked into it too deep on what that includes, if it is state agencies, if it is for commercial, we'll find out. Again, with some of these things we have learned with getting them licensed, especially the big one, due to its size, it actually gets a tail number. And we have not done this before. We are not in the aviation industry. And so it's been months that we've been even trying to get the paperwork done, not even sent in, but just get all the information and right stuff we need. I mean, it's getting to where we've had to go to the AG's office to say that DFW, Washington, the Fish and Wildlife, is actually a state agency, so that we can get one of the waivers of being an agency. It's not being used in a commercial setting, I guess. And so I would think at this point, we're probably looking at having to hire a consultant, which again, increases costs on a lot of this stuff on what's already very expensive. And it's kind of disappointing because just talking to the people that have been flying the drones and these kinds of things a lot is that the DJI is just above and beyond on just their software platform, and what their drones can do and how they can kind of talk to each other. Whereas I think the only other one I can think of that can spray is Helio, which is out of Texas. And they have nice drones, but again, the drone itself is well over 2 times the amount, and the software that went with them, at least when we were looking at them, was nowhere near what we're able to do with the DJI setup. So it's kind of like, are we even going to be able to use these very much in the future? Do you know what software they use to process the ortho? There is a lot. So there is a program that we have that's called Smart Farm. It is the DJI software. Those will process the orthos. But then There's like Pix 4D that I know a lot of people are using for imagery, and there's a couple other ones that I'm not very familiar with that the RGIS program knows about. But again, a lot of those software, kind of like stitching, ortho, they're not cheap. So I haven't really got to play with them because I think a license was a couple grand. And so not knowing if it's going to fit our needs, I have not got the approval to kind of like just, I don't know, get a trial license. Do you know whether DFW areas need to apply for operational waiver from the FAA to conduct price? I'm not quite sure what you mean by operational waiver, but yeah, so you have to have your Part 107, and then they have their ones to be able to fly over, fly drones that are over 50 pounds. And then there's also what the FAA calls the dispersion of economic poisons, which is your herbicide, but it's also anything else. Being these are used sometimes for farming, that includes fertilizer and even seeding. You have to get another endorsement for that. And then also the endorsement for, what was it? I think they had one for out of line of sight for X amount of time. How much can the spray drone carry? Capacity 110 pounds. So the T40, that means it's 40 liters. But I guess the contractor used he had the earlier version, the T30s, which are 30-liter capacity. But pretty much we got as that you never fill them to the full amount. They had ones that they were carrying, and I think they had a little bit too full. And then also, if they were in some hilly environments, kind of on the east side, some rolling hills, and the drone came up over a hill, and it's set to be at a certain distance over the ground, and so it tried to compensate and drop down, and then when it hit that, it tried to like hold all that weight from keeping going down, and it blew a motor, and then they had to go chase after their drone in kind of a goalie, which, yeah, they kind of learned, they were passing down some of our lessons from some of their bad experiences with that. But that is something that they've had happen to V4, is in requires maintenance too. Is after so much time, hours, whatever else, there is maintenance to these things that has to be logged. What is the cost difference between drones and a Marshmaster? Our Marshmaster, you're probably talking $200,000. Drone, you can get the spray drone itself is probably 15 to 20,000. And so you could get a pretty good size fleet of the spray drones going, which the T40s, you can only fly by themselves. The contractor was using the T30s because they can link up. So each pilot can be flying 3 drones at a time. And so it just helps with their efficiency. And I think they had it down to pretty much a drone lands on the ground, and they pull batteries, fill it, and put new batteries in there in probably about 60 seconds. How long does drone battery last? Yeah, so the big ones, pretty much 8 to 10 minutes, depending on how much you're carrying. There are some of those times when they were a little bit farther out there. They'd only fill the tank like half or quarter of the way full just so they could get some more battery time. So they could get it out there, spray it, and then get it back. But the controller, again, once you put it in there, you're monitoring, and it does pretty good at letting you know like how fast you're using it. I do believe we got the large seed spreader for the drone. And honestly, I haven't even been able to fly our big drone yet, because we're still working on getting that tail number to get it registered with the FAA. So it's been sitting in storage for almost 8 months now. Just kind of sitting in the warehouse waiting until we can get those numbers, because we have to have that before it can even get up off the air. on your land north towards the legal use. Yeah, I'd be excited to just kind of see how this goes. And again, we have some of the areas that we do a lot of waterfowl forage, and it'd be nice just to even just filling those things full of your barley or millet and just go and spreading that around. Curious if you have good information about historical present abundance of native cattail on the sites. So what we were hearing, particularly we worked close with Greg Hood that didn't make it in the beginning, the second presenter, and he said he's only seen the native cattail a handful of times in the, I don't know how long he's been out there, quite a while. And so most of it has been hybridized with the non-native, and that's one of the issues we're having is you see a lot of people talking about the cattail. They're 6-8 feet tall, but when we get into this on some of this hybridized cattail, I mean, I think we've probably found stuff that's 14. It was taller than the boom that we had up there. And yeah, it's definitely noticed some of it in the salinity. It just, there's very specific parts on kind of where it goes, but then you'll just randomly see a clone farther out that is the non-native. Using your ortho imagery and monitoring and yeah, so this is going to be in the fun thing too of kind of being able to fly over areas that we treated the year before, probably in June, early July, trying to be able to fly over and see how your treatments actually worked, and is a bunch of non-native still coming back, or is it kind of the cattail dead for now, and then you ended up with all your plantain or whatever else that kind of starts coming in? And do you have software able to annotate it? The software side, we don't know yet. We have done a couple flights for our Spartina program, and trying to see, because those are usually individual plants, but the color is very vibrant compared to a lot of the sedges. So we tried to do flights over to see if we could get enough sample sizes that we could put into like one of those programs that would automatically kind of point out where the Spartina is, instead of having to do everything on foot. At least you have a good idea where like some of the heavy density is. But from what we were seeing, you were having to fly so low, the amount of data that you, like, we were probably having to fly at 75 feet high. So that imagery data, when you're doing, what is it, 70 by 80 overlap, like, is so much data that it's questionable how much it's worth it. They released a list of approved drones on my phone. Otherwise, I'd like to find the list in case anyone's going to purchase one. Okay, so they did release a list. So that one I haven't seen that either. Possibly open source mapping tools. Yes. I am not the best GIS person. I barely get by. So when we get into some of the open source stuff, I am not really sure. I try to rely on the GIS department on some of that stuff. We were watering the plant areas, cut the plant down, and see the mega. Last this weekend. Okay, Jenny. So yeah, there's kind of the difference between excuse me. So I know there's some changes in the amount. So I guess with gallons per acre, even though we're still only doing 3 gallons per acre, we're still doing the label rate of whatever the four pints for what is it, the Polaris. So even though on say the ground base, like the boom I guess section, we're probably putting 20 gallons an acre, so it's just a lot more carrier. Then so there's just a lot more water involved, and you can get a lot more done, it seems, with the drone without having to stop, set up. Which even for us, it was the biggest issue of just the refilling the drones versus the actual flying. We had, I think, 3 or 4 people like trying to keep up, filling the jugs to be able to fill the drones fast enough. When we have results on efficient drones, scroll video. I have no idea yet on the results that we'll have for the efficiency. It's kind of, hopefully we'll have something at least anecdotal at the end of midsummer next year. Once everything kind of starts to grow back and we can actually see how effective it was. But otherwise, I think that's it.
Oh, some more questions just trickled in.
Okay, have you used your drones to monitor your bird serving? So that is what I am trying to do right now. There between the snow geese and swans is trying to find probably good weather to do it. Between the freezing temperatures, which you can't fly those things at a certain temp, and then the amount of participation or the low cloud ceiling, that I haven't been able to fly too much. But yeah, we're trying to get it to where we can kind of tell kind of a juvenile to adult ratio, especially in the snow geese, since we know they end up losing a bunch, and then we had kind of some bouts with some bird flu. We tried to consider helicopter spraying for this project. Yes, we have done helicopter spraying twice. We did one kind of pilot project on a 10-acre chunk, which that one worked really well. And then we also did another one later that was 60 acres, I believe. And again, that worked pretty well. It's just the cost for what we're doing. A lot of the helicopters, they want big, wide, and long kind of routes to go in, and they can just kind of go fill it in. They're not doing this on, off, on, off, on, off, and they have to be going kind of a certain, I guess it seemed like a speed to kind of make sure that they were consistent. So being that we're doing some of the chunks that I think I showed earlier, kind of here. So they weren't spraying all in this green, but they're only doing this little green or little I guess I need the laser pointer. They're not doing all the green, they're just spraying these little yellow things inside. So there's some of these ones where, I mean, you're talking a 50 by 50 foot patch, or sometimes even less, to some other bigger patches that were many acres. And so to be able to get a helicopter to go in there and do that was not cost prohibitive. And then we also were fighting some of that with the forestry and wildfires, is that a lot of the helicopters we get pulled into a lot of that stuff, and it just wasn't kind of worth it. Humidity, visibility. So I don't know Humidity, not so much. But just to be able to get up in the air, you have to have what your ceiling, 1,000-foot ceiling plus couple miles of visibility. And then yeah, you can, for label rate, it still applies. So it has to be under 10 miles an hour. So yeah, we kind of lucked out on the time. But there was a couple mornings that we pretty much just kind of had to sit there and walk around, do a couple coffee runs, waiting for the fog to lift so that we could have the ceiling to be able to fly. So yeah, that does affect it does become a factor.
So our next presenter is Dan Sorensen, who's going to talk about King County. Oh, sorry, who's going to talk about the Healthy Lands Project. Dan has been with the King County Noxious Weed Control Program for over 6 years. In his current role, he manages the Healthy Lands Project, whose aim is to implement noxious weed control and foster stewardship on conservation lands throughout King County. He has over 15 years experience in stewardship and restoration. He holds a master's degree from the University of Washington in restoration ecology and environmental horticulture, and he also volunteers at a local greenbelt in Seattle, removing blackberry and ivy to give the future forest there the best chance to thrive.
Thank you for that introduction. It's been such great presentations today, folks. It's been really nice to hear everyone. And we're almost there, so thank you all for sticking with us. And I'm here today to talk to you about the Healthy Lands Project. The Healthy Lands Project, I'm going to give sort of a big, broad overview. There's a lot of facets to it, and certainly ask questions. I'll try to answer them, and you can always contact me after for more information. But you know, we've all been where this person is photographed standing in a plethora of noxious weeds, wondering what to do. And so the Healthy Lands Project in some ways helps the landowner to avoid sort of feeling so overwhelmed by their weed issues. Let me just give a plug for the program that I'm a part of, the Noxious Weed, King County Noxious Weed Control Program. And we have some great resources on our website if you are unaware of that. I know this is sort of a little south of where a lot of folks are coming from today, but we have some great fact sheets and BMPs. We also have a really fun Instagram account, so if you're not following us already, you should totally follow us. And a quarterly blog post that goes out, and we talk about all things noxious weeds, and that's a lot of fun too. So check us out on all the sort of channels, and you know, hopefully you can make some laughs through learn some stuff, have some laughs through the Instagram, and if you ever need us, here's our email and contact information. We get calls from all across the country, so we will for sure take calls from Skagit, Whatcom, and other counties north. So the Healthy Lands Project, it kind of all started with ivy. Historically, the King County Noxious Weed Control Program focused their efforts on mostly the weeds that are designated for control by the state and county board. We call them regulated weeds in King County. So if a noxious weed is designated for control at the state level or the county level, we call it regulated, regardless of its weed class. I mean, we certainly prioritize the Class A weeds and some higher priority Class Bs versus the designated Bs, and we have a few designated Cs. But ivy is a Class C, and it is not designated. In 2017, 2018, our county executive said, "Hey, you're the noxious weed program. Ivy's a noxious weed. How come? What are you going to do to control it?" And so he said, "Come up with a proposal." So folks came up with a proposal, and it was modest, kind of within the means. And then he said, "Well, think bigger. And so sort of expanding out, the issue with all these unregulated weeds, which tend to be the more widespread weeds, is that they're everywhere. And, how do you sort of bound or constrain what we can do across the landscape? It was chosen that we're going to focus on sort of conservation lands, and we're going to kind of build a noxious weed control program, we're going to expand our program into the areas that are sort of identified by the Land Conservation Initiative, which is a King County initiative to protect and acquire lands that meet certain criteria in King County, and I'll get to that in a second. We have had historically some programs that dealt with the unregulated weeds, and some knotweed along some rivers, and also some other smaller projects like yellow flag iris along lakes. But this was the first time we're really doing sort of a larger across the county control of certain things. The County Council funded us as part of our assessment increase for the 2019 budget and added money primarily for contractor control and staffing, and some small money for staffing and supplies to implement what was soon to be called the Healthy Lands Project. Those efforts, those control efforts, were to sort of match what the sort of Land Conservation Initiative was doing across King County. And so the Land Conservation Initiative was to protect kind of the last greatest parcels along King County. And so they sort of identified 65,000 acres of potentially open space and said, let's do that in the next 30 years. And since that actually has been accelerated to be under 30 years and closer to 15 years. And so what protection looks like, it could be acquisitions, easement, through current use taxation, and transfer of development rights. And what the Healthy Lands Project does is works on these parcels that have been protected or will be protected through the LCI. And I'll give a really, hopefully a good example towards the end with lots of nice pictures. You've seen this graph before today in a slightly different form. Just sort of want to give you the context of what we're sort of trying to do here with the more widespread unregulated weeds in King County. We're looking at the sort of right side of the curve where the areas occupied and the sort of population has saturated every place it's going to be. You're going to find it typically in the ecosystems which they're going to invade. So we're doing asset-based protection here by identifying these conservation lands, identifying some whatever resources are on those lands, and reducing significantly reducing the impact of noxious weeds on those lands. And I should say the sort of targeted noxious weeds, the ones that are having the most impact. So our aim is to kind of change the trajectory of the landscape by removing the noxious weeds. Typically, most noxious weeds you can get, about 80%, 75 to 80% control within the first year. And it's always the last 10%, the last 1% is always the hardest. So we're doing that, the big lift to get that to that 80 to 90%, which we will fund work on these lands, be it public or private. And then after 2 to 3 years, the landowner is in charge of doing that maintenance work. We're trying to get over that sort of invasion, get over the hump, so they can get it to sort of a maintenance phase. So they have sort of the capacity and ability to do that control themselves. And so what does that look like? I'll go over the process in more detail, but we do invasive weed mapping and what we call a weed prescription, which is a control document. We get agreements from the landowner. We sort of have a non-binding agreement that they will commit to doing the work. There's sort of no penalty if they don't do the work, but we're sort of bargaining in good faith. But we also try to match them up with other partners who might give them support like revegetation or potential open space protection, and also offer technical assistance or workshops to sort of bolster their own knowledge and capacity to do the work. And then we implement the weed control through contracted crews. We will sort of do follow-up site visits to make sure things are looking good. If working with the landowner, if not, we can always go back in and do a little like booster shot with these crews after the 2 to 3 years of initial and follow-up control. The ideal is to create this long-term relationship with these landowners so they feel like they're empowered to take this work on themselves on their land. So what lands are eligible? Like I said, it's all around the sort of the land conservation initiative. So this includes lands in cities and unincorporated areas that are in the process of being protected or have been recently protected. And those have been identified by the Land Conservation Initiative. It includes current use taxation, and we have forest, timber, and ag, as well as our public benefit rating system, which is more for smaller acreage protection. That's a variety of different categories. But we can also work on properties adjacent to those LCI lands and adjacent rights of way. Additionally, we've carved out some areas within King County that have been identified by part of the LCI as equity opportunity areas, and we can also do this weed control work there. The sites that we're looking at meet the definition of an opportunity area, and they generally are green spaces that sort of have the potential to function as beneficial community open space or currently doing so, but they're being impacted by noxious weeds. There's some public maps that are really nice. I can put the link a little later on, but this is one of the links to the LCI acquisition map. This will show all the lands that the LCI has considers sort of protected under this LCI, and the LCI has a funding mechanism called Conservation Futures Trust. So like a lot of these properties you see here have been protected by the funded by the Conservation Futures tax in King County. The Healthy Lands Project has worked on maybe a quarter of these parcels. They haven't worked on all of them. So there definitely is more being protected that we have sort of capacity to do. So we are sort of prioritizing and trying to work with our county partners and city partners to do this work there. Additionally, we're working with private landowners whose lands might not be protected at all or have been protected through conservation easements, and trying to do that weed control work on those lands. This is the map of the equity opportunity areas. And so, what the heck is that? This is a product of the Equity Open Space Cabinet's report. They sort of looked at what the LCI was doing. They said, hey, you weren't protecting anything in the sort of more urban areas, but those are really important and we got to protect green space there. And so there were some definitions around what this equity opportunity areas were, and then it sort of waived a match waiver for acquisitions in those areas, land protection acquisitions and other land protection. What constitutes an equity opportunity area, there's 3 mapped criteria. And that includes, it's the highest 1/3 zip codes for hospitalization for asthma, diabetes, and heart disease. And so health outcomes. It also has the lowest 1/3 of census tracts for income. So we're talking about resources and income, as well as limited or no publicly owned or accessible open space within a 1/4 mile in urban areas and 2 miles in rural areas. And this actually has changed somewhat with the 2020 census, but for the most part, this is what it looks like. And we also have a public map that shows what it is, and this is the link to it, and you can get more detailed information on exactly what these are. So that's the sort of overview of what lands are sort of eligible for this work. So not every parcel in King County is eligible for this. The site is identified as a help candidate in some capacity. be it through referrals by partner agencies, King Conservation District, or cities, or just landowners reaching out to us. A lot of the King County staff the King County Noxious Weed Control specialists are working with landowners already, and they implement a lot of these programs or help implement these programs, and they're also talking with landowners and referring them to the Healthy Lands Project for weed control funding. We contact the landowner or they contact us. We'll do a quick assessment. We track everything in a GIS Enterprise, ArcGIS Enterprise feature service, and I'll go into that a little later. Once we do this quick assessment, we sort of gauge where the landowners, what they want to do, where they want to go with this. We do some invasive mapping inventory, so we do a very thorough job inventorying the property. We'll look at cultural resources review if there's going to be ground disturbance. We'll also review critical areas and understand local ordinances around that. There's herbicide restrictions in some cities. And so we'll take that all into account, and then we'll draft a control plan, which we call a weed prescription, and work with the landowner to finalize that. And then they'll sign a sort of an agreement that says, yes, you can do the work as defined in this control plan. From that control plan, we'll develop a work order for the vendor. Oh, there we go. So agreement signed, the work order is finalized, and we send it out to bid. We have a select vendor pool, which includes restoration companies. These crews are used to sort of more rugged areas, working on steeper slopes, or just working in blackberry thickets. So they do great work. Contractor is selected. You sort of give the notice to proceed, and then work can begin. We give contractors program phones that we pay for to submit work activity via the ArcGIS database and through Survey 123. The first year, we're looking at trying to get 80 to 85 reduction in the weeds. The follow-up treatments using the second year, we're trying to get to 90%. After 2 to 3 years, we don't fund contractors anymore, but we can help in other ways. We can do small amounts of plant purchases under $200 per landowner, and offer some in-house control if need be. But the noxious weed staff, a lot of the regional control specialists and riparian specialists remain in contact with the landowner and offer check-ins and support. So this is how we're tracking the work. Again, we're using Enterprise, formerly ArcGIS Online, but now we're in Enterprise portal, working with web maps and apps, as well as field maps on our phones. We have a phase layer that helps track process. We have a scoping survey that provides quick assessments that we can take field notes, quick notes while we're in the field doing those initial visits. We do that more comprehensive noxious weed inventory through field maps and quick capture. And then the contractors put in a series of activity logs through Survey 123, and those involve weed control, planting when they do, and some maintenance activities when the site requires it. This is what these phases mean, and I'm not going to sort of go over all of them, but we do have sort of initial interest, crew time, maintenance, and then we're getting now. Healthy Lands Project is going on its 5th year, so we're starting to really get the time to go back and see where some of these projects that we haven't funded control on for a number of years, go back and see where those are. This is what it looks like on our web maps. It can be a bit of a hodgepodge sometimes of different phases. The red's crew time, the blue is initial interest. Point of showing this is that we can track as we go and really see what lands are in what phase, and this has since been updated. This is from a number about 2 years ago. The Survey 123 forms are really useful because they allow us to get good data from the contractors. They give us, they use the field maps to launch Survey 123, and this way we sort of have a direct link to the zone and site names. They enter their hours, they put in a geospatial location, and then they do the sort of control list. So they'll enter the species name, area control, percent cover, yes or no to follow-up work, and control method. So it's fairly straightforward, pretty easy questions. But what this allows us to do is take that data and we integrate it with Power BI, and we can produce top level reporting outputs really easily. There's some editing that has to happen, user error, and just new crews come on. There has to be trained. They have to be trained and whatnot. So it's not no work, but it does take a little work to make sure folks are using all those Survey 123 forms correctly. But you can kind of see the progression from 2019, starting off with 4.1 net area of control, 8 sites. Fast forward to just finishing up 2023, we're at 49 sites with almost 92 acres of control. And you can also see how much follow-up control, which is important. You know, we're not just doing that initial control. We're really, the goal is to leave the site with all the noxious weeds that we targeted to be under 90% reduced, so 10% of their original footprint. This is our sort of all-time control area. And so I just thought it'd be, you know, if you're wondering what type of work, you know, what weeds are you seeing? And it should surprise no one that we're controlling the most of blackberry. And holly is a King County weed of concern, so we can control it as part of the Healthy Lands Project, even though it's not designated as a noxious weed at the state level. But it is a serious forest weed, and we are controlling it on those upland forest parcels and all around where we encounter it. And then we have ivy, Scotch broom, Bohemian hybrid knotweed, Canarygrass, and you can see the list there. And holly, ivy, and blackberry is most of our control work. There are a few other things that come into play, and we've been learning, you know, how to control these weeds as we go, and we're still turning dials. This is sort of just a map to show what our spatial distribution of project sites look like, and you know, you can see that we've worked all across King County, mostly around river systems, but also in and around recently protected open space. Just to give you an idea that we are across all of King County, and we do have parcel assemblages where we're working on, you know, maybe 2 or 3 40-acre parcels, or we've done work 2 years ago on one parcel, but now another parcel has come into the King County Parks inventory, or it's been recently protected, and we'll be working on that. The story I'll tell to sort of iterate it and highlight kind of how we do the work is the story of Glendale Forest. Now, Glendale is a 5-acre forested parcel in an urban unincorporated part of King County. It was on our radar, working with one of the county land on the open space team. They sort of are doing projects, but also seeking relationships with landowners for acquisition. Told us about this project, and this is in one of those equity opportunity areas. King County Parks was able to apply for funding to get this protected and not have to offer a waiver, a 50% match waiver. We worked with that King County Park staff on the open space team to get permission from the landowner, who did not live in this country, to map the weeds in the winter of 2020. King County Parks then acquired the parcel in June 2020, but because we have already mapped the weeds, we did the weed prescription. We kind of turned that into a work order, and we were able to queue up work fairly quickly, and we prioritized this work because it was in one of those equity opportunity areas. And we had help crews Dirt Corps was the crew that did it, and they started work there in June 2020. This gives you a little idea of where it was in relation to King County. It doesn't look like much of an urban area, but this area actually had little public natural areas up against a state highway with some wetland buffered areas. There's a golf course nearby, there's a school, but there really isn't sort of a place that's in a more natural state for the residents to enjoy. And this also abuts an apartment complex, so you sort of have a dense kind of living situation, and also some smaller parcels of single family housing. And this is what it looked like. You know, it was the who's who of noxious weeds. It had a decent native deciduous canopy, had a few evergreen trees, but it really was just being completely inundated with blackberry and ivy and holly. You get a sense here in this photo of just the scale of everything. Almost every tree had ivy in it. It was going down to the creek that cut through the property. There was scattered holly, some laurel. And so in our mapping, we identified almost 3 acres of ivy, over 3 acres of blackberry. And this is gross cover, about 2 acres of common holly. I mean, that was much smaller in terms of the net area. But the idea is that this place was covered with noxious weeds in every way. We hired Dirt Corps in 2020 to start that work. That was a competitive bid process. They got started. They did the initial control. We cut all got the ivy off the trees. We used herbicide. We also used manual control in places. Second year, we saw the forest really respond and kind of bounce back really well. All of a sudden, where we killed the blackberries and cleared the ivy, you have these spring ephemerals coming through. And so almost immediately, the idea of help is to move the trajectory away from invasion towards one of sort of recovery and increasing noxious weed cover. And just by simply doing the control work, we were doing that. This is what it looked like in spring 2021, all the ivy's off the trees and the crew's doing follow-up work on blackberry and ivy, sort of on the more higher parts of it. There's another view of it. This is before some of that ivy got more controlled and some of the follow-up blackberry. But over the next from 2020 to 2022, we cleared almost 3.5 net acres of blackberry, over 1.5 acres of ivy, the holly, and those are all initial controls. And you can kind of see we did the follow-up control as well. It's worth noting that our follow-up controls, you know, what we do more follow-up control versus less follow-up control on. Certainly blackberry very easily comes back. It's in the seed bank. It really is. You have to be more of a vigilant on that. Interestingly enough, the knotweed never really came back. It disappeared pretty quickly. It was kind of in a disturbed, well-drained soil. It kind of was already, I think, stressed. And so one stem has come back in 2023, and we're going to treat that next year. So this is what it's looking like these days. We had last fall, we had a crew come through and do a little more control work. The Washington Trails Association has a program here that they're building trail for more public access. So we're sort of doing that work in partnership with, well, in association with them in a way to make sure both of our efforts align. And this spring, again, just to sort of leave you with what's happening on this site, you know, when you're removing that invasive species pressure, this is a really wet mesic forest. It's on the base of a hill, so we do have a lot of water coming in, and it's just allowing these spring ephemerals, which just were either struggling or in the seed bank under the blackberries and ivy, to thrive. Since there has been some planting by King County Parks, those pink flaggings are either where there's protected plants like that trillium or planted stuff, some evergreens and shrubs. So that's the Healthy Lands Project. I'm sure I haven't looked at all the questions, but I'm happy to answer some questions now. The increasing deforestation of Seattle affecting exotic weed problems? Well, I think it's kind of multiple pathways, but one of the two things that's happening is that it's the lack or degrading canopy cover is allowing light to penetrate, and that light is allowing those species that would otherwise be controlled somewhat by shade, like blackberry, to really thrive. And what it's also doing is just creating some disturbance. Wind throw allows trees to come down. That tree opens up disturbance areas, and so kind of a twofold problem with increased disturbance. And if there's any kind of erosion issues happening, because there's less, there's like monocultures of ivy, which don't really hold the soil in together. Then that creates additional pathways for those exotic weed problems to continue. So our ivy control BMPs, right now we're doing a 3 to 4% triclopyr and a bit of 4% surfactant, and we've been pretty effective with that depending on time of year. We've also done, I think, a 2% Imazapry and been effective in that. We have tried out Vastland, which is the choline formula of triclopyr. It has been effective, but it's very slow going. One thing I've noticed about ivy control is that sometimes you will not notice ivy being controlled, or you won't notice the ivy looking dead until the summer drought. It kind of stays green. It may not look healthy, but it stays green enough where you're questioning whether or not you had effective control, and then the summer drought usually kills it off. So that's something to note, that if you're controlling in the winter, you might not see efficacy until the summer.
Our final presenter is Lauren Kuehne, who's going to talk about lessons learned from 20 years of knotweed management in an unregulated river. Lauren is an environmental scientist who focuses on supporting management of aquatic and riparian systems. She received her MS in aquatic and fishery science from the University of Washington in 2012, where she was a research scientist until 2019. Her work encompasses diverse conservation issues, including fish, forests, invasive species, and noise pollution. Most of Ms. Kuehne's research is in Western Washington and collaboration with agencies, tribes, and nonprofits doing on-the-ground restoration. Her research also reflects a commitment to science communication and outreach, including community science, blogging, public talks, media presence, and op-ed articles.
Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. Okay, I'm traveling today and my flight got delayed, in fact, at the airport. And hopefully the announcements won't be too bad, but I'm going to, thanks for everyone for sticking in today to listen to this talk. And I'm excited to share work with you. This data set that I'm going to be talking about, one of the data sets I'm going to be talking about, has been 22 decades in the making. And so I'm excited to share that. And then this is kind of two talks about 2/3 of the way. I'm going to switch gears and talk about an herbicide trial done in conjunction with Dave Heimer at State of Washington. But first, I'm going to talk about lessons learned from 20 years of management. And unfortunately, because I was on an airplane, I missed Bengt's talk. Hopefully we're not overlapping too much, but maybe we will be confirming what the others said. So the data set that I'm going to be talking about today is out on the Hoh River on the Olympic Peninsula in Western Washington. And 10,000 Years Institute has been the lead entity now. 10,000 Years leading this work, but it has been incredibly collaborative. It was started by the Hoh tribe, has been sustained by multiple tribes are in that area. U.S. Forest Service, state agencies have worked on this effort for over 20 years. 10,000 Years Institute, what they do though is they work on best practices for integrated restoration, and they focus a lot on riparian ecosystems and invasive species management and removal. And they really, 10,000 Years Institute really likes to integrate science into their work. And so that's part of the reason why they've been documenting this data for a long time while they have done restoration. So Hoh River is very famous. It's the site of the Hoh rainforest, right? And it's one of the several, so many of the rivers, most of the rivers out on the Olympic Peninsula are a little unusual, unregulated. Most of them are undammed. And so the Hoh River is like this 80 kilometers of undammed river on the Olympic Peninsula. It is a rainforest, so it meets the criteria for a rainforest. Originates at the Hoh Glacier on Mount Olympus, and of course the Hoh rainforest is world famous. It's actually a World Heritage Area in the national park. It has a lot of abundant wild fish population because it has relatively pristine habitat for and intact riparian areas and habitat. So we have a lot of fish populations out there, and fishing is obviously of enormous cultural importance to the tribes there, as well as recreational fishing too that come for that area. Now, the history of this invasion, the opportunity, if you will, to study this happened because, well, I hate to call it an opportunity, but this is what happened. In 1999, a river channel avulsion captured a knotweed clump and it moved it into the river, probably from a kind of a farm garden. So that river channel avulsion happened at basically river mile 30. And since then, it was detected a couple of years later, but by that time the knotweed had spread. It was detected pretty shortly after this storm event, or this river migration event that avulsed into the knotweed into the river. And so between 1999, it was detected in 2001, so about 2 years of some survey and some treatment before treatment was actually started. And the first funding was in 2001 from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And that's actually, this is a picture of Jill Silver, 10,000 Years Institute flagging knotweed on the Hoh River. So 2001 was a long time ago. The interesting part about this story is that Jill and the Hoh tribe and other entities, the Wild Fish Conservancy, and I mean, there's just so many, the acknowledgement slide is hugely full, have for this 20-year period, we started with knotweed in 2001, and then did survey and treatment and control work through 2010. Well, actually through all of these. But in 2010, started adding treatment and control for other invasive species, so Scotch broom and reed canarygrass, and so this effort has been sustained over this entire time period. You can see, diverse forms of funding have been tapped, diverse initiatives have been utilized to make this a sustained. Sorry, I'm going to let that announcement go a little bit while I change slides. Thank you. And like I said, it's, 10,000 years is kind of the lead entity, if you will, but it has been there have been so many collaborators, so many people have done the survey work over this period of time. Here's a picture of Jill giving a training to folks. Now, this is a beautiful photo. It's nice to just capture the wild and relatively pristine area, but it also captures the magnitude of the challenge here. This is it's an unregulated river. It's very dynamic. It moves a lot. There's a lot of sediment that moves around. The gravel bars move. There's a lot of vegetation and a lot of survey to cover. So many of the challenges over the years have been, how do we find these plants in this dynamic, not only large area, but a dynamic area from year to year. So survey challenges include the diversity of habitats. Knotweed will establish on gravel bars. It will establish in willow thickets. It will establish in forested areas. It will establish in these, log jams, all of which have enormous, the Hoh River has enormous areas, all of these types of habitat. And so finding ways over the years to comprehensively find the knotweed as it has moved has been an ongoing challenge. And so, for example, there's the needle in the haystack, if you will, of the challenge of what trying to remove knotweed from this river has looked like over time. Just to give you a summary of, what that overarching effort has looked like, the monitoring and restoration work in general. Of course, it's changed from year to year. It has had to be flexible and change from year to year, depending on funding or crew logistics or what kind of personnel were available, these kind of things. But overall, the control area is downstream of that introduction point at River Mile 30. It has continued almost every year since then. So in most patches and in most years, knotweed has been surveyed and treated in the earlier years with glyphosate injection, and then they switched to foliar species. And then starting around 2008, switched to incorporating Imazapry. And for the most part now it's Imazapry that's used almost exclusively now. But overall, for the most part, it's been consistently surveyed and treated in each year in most regions. This would be our monitoring and control area. This is the area that gets of monitoring and control from every year from 2002 to the present. So when Jill and I have been talking for many years about doing something with these data, because every year that they surveyed and controlled, they also kept very careful records of what they treated and where they surveyed and where they found knotweed. And so all this data was being collected. And so what we saw as an opportunity, well, let's try and do something with this data to inform management in other rivers. And there were a couple different stories to come out of that. One is that because we are analyzing knotweed presence and establishment over 30 river miles, 90 kilometers, we thought that we could establish, say, well, what are these landscape factors that, where do we see knotweed showing up again and again, no matter how much you treat it? And where are we seeing it persist and where are we seeing it establish? Where is it piling up on the river? Where are we able to eradicate it? And so we thought that it might be possible to identify the landscape factors that would allow us to assess where these hotspots are and if there are, factors associated with persistence. But the other part of it is that every year there is information that's been collected in terms of anecdotal observation, but they may be anecdotal, they may be observational data, but if you observe them over 20 years, they start to pile up. And so we wanted to try and find out, there's also, within these 20 years of reports and documentation, there's lessons for adaptive management, because of course, 20 years ago, we knew less about knotweed, than we do now. And so there's a story in all of these documentation around how do we adaptively manage and learn as we go. So that was our two research goals. Was one, to analyze this 20-year data set, and the second was try and capture, what are the lessons that we can take, and then to help people that are dealing with knotweed in other river systems, or to communicate the management story. So the first one I'm going to talk about is modeling. I like nerdy modeling stuff. Hopefully this doesn't bore everyone, but we wanted to say, well, what are the landscape factors where we're seeing, associated with establishment persistence of knotweed? And so what we did is we have these knotweed observations, right, in our monitoring and control area. So here, this is knotweed points from 2002. Now we have data points like this, spatially referenced data points like this from 2002 to the present, to 2023 each year for knotweed for most of the river reaches. So then what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, okay, well, we've got this longitudinal record. And we had some hypotheses that we said, okay, well, we think that, proximity to the source will have a positive effect. The closer we are to the source, the more knotweed we'd expect to find. The treatment year, obviously we're treating it every year, so that the knotweed should go down in every year. The active channel width, we thought that a wider channel should be associated with more knotweed, channel braiding, positive, channel sinuosity, right? All of these factors, we had these hypotheses about the direction that it would be pushing presence and abundance and density of knotweed. Down here, just to show you this percent forested, that means the percent forested in, at the edge of the channel, right? And the percent emergent wetland is also at the edge of the channel. So that was how we set up, how we wanted to go about doing this modeling to assess these factors. The steps to do that, so we have our knotweed points, and we're going to assign them to these river kilometer bins. So here is 30 river miles, and each of these is a river, the center of the river kilometer. So this becomes our river kilometer bins. And we're going to create covariates for each one of those points. Here's our monitoring and control area. Here's again, like our 2002 knotweed points. And then we assign these knotweed points to its river kilometer bin, and then we create covariates, and then we're going to model those with the years. For people that want to know how we came up with these covariates, here's the mouth of the river right here. And so each of these, this is like quarter mile points. And so to do the active channel braiding, we take 4 samples per river kilometer, and you just measure the active width and you measure the amount of braiding in it. For the percent forest, we did that by taking each of those points again, and then taking this 500-meter buffer around these sample points. And we're binning it by river kilometer and then creating these covariates. And then we're going to model that for folks that like modeling, to know about modeling. We're creating these models out of our variables here. And then we use model selection using AIC. And then the top model, we're going to evaluate the effect sizes. The way that we did this is we created a bunch of different models, and then we used AIC to say, well, which one of these models is our best fit? And then that final model has effect sizes. For example, it will say the effect size of channel braiding is this, and we'll look at those results in just a minute. Okay, this is the first result slide. It was the best way that we could figure out how to create these data or show these data, but it's not exactly intuitive. So first thing that you're looking at is year. Okay, so year, we're starting down here at 2002, going up to 2023, right? So time is moving up through the top. And then on this bottom, we have river kilometers. So this is the mouth of the river. And then this is our most upstream extent, right? And sorry, the green, the density is the density of the number of knotweed observations in that year. And so the darkest green is going to have a lot of knot observations, whereas white is basically 0 knotweed observations by river kilometer. So this is 2002, and this is the knot points in that year. And so what we're seeing here is sort of a correspondence between the knotweed densities, right? And in that year, the gray means that it was not surveyed. So now that we've sort of oriented ourselves to this plot, the take-home message on this is that we see pretty effectively through time the reduction in knotweed density. Obviously, the highest density was up here near the source, early years, 2002 to say 2010. But then we start lots and lots more white, where we're having basically 0 knotweed. And that has continued. You know, as we come through time, we're seeing less and less knotweed in each of these river kilometers, and that's because of this sustained survey and control. So then here, what I'm going to show you is this is actually the results of the modeling. So we had those hypotheses about these different factors, right? We said the proximity to source, and we said year, and we said, well, what would these have positive or negative effects? And right here, what I've put is a check mark if it lined up with our hypothesis. So for example, proximity to the source was positive, more knotweed closer to the source. Year, you know, was negative. Here we see the negative effect of year. Sorry, my mouse, I keep trying to, there it is. The one that didn't line up, so sinuosity, so a more sinuous channel, we see higher persistence or establishment of knotweed there. Channel braiding did not. So more braided channels were not, they were actually associated with a negative. And so there's more to explore there. Percent forested was a little bit negative. And then here, this was a bit, well, it wasn't surprising, but the percent emergent wetland that was in, these are 500-meter buffers. So percent emergent wetland had a strong positive association with knotweed presence. So I think this was really, it's interesting. And it's good. It shows us that the landscape factors can predict. We can, you know, at least take an initial cut at saying, well, what landscape factors where we might expect to see more knotweed and where we might see it being harder to eradicate. However, what there is to work on here and refine this is that the total variance that this model is explaining, I mean, it depends. I showed this to someone else and they were like, this is explaining a lot of variance. I think it can do better, but there's a lot more that we can do in terms of adding in new variables or modifying variables. So then the second part of this was how do we summarize these adaptive management lessons? So I mentioned that in each year there are these documentation, and mostly this is in reports. But what we wanted to do is try and capture and summarize these persistent, consistent observations and consistent trends. And so I'm not going to go through each one of these, but we're preparing a publication, and I can share this information with anyone. this what I'm going to show this slide is just a summary slide. So from each of these, 20 plus years of observational data, what we have is that from year to year, the annual control rates are quite high. We're seeing good treatment and control of individual plants of knotweed. And then, of course, what I showed you in that earlier slide is that we're seeing the knotweed bias. We're seeing the number of stems go down. We're seeing the clusters go down. We're seeing the height of the plants going down. What I didn't show you, and I have data on this as well, but what we were seeing at the same time is that in years with large flooding events, we were seeing lateral and upland spread of knotweed into the upland terraces and then pushing out into the river. So the challenge, of course, is that our survey and control effort, even though the knotweed is going down, you have to look harder for it. It's smaller plants that are more spread out, and they're pushing with associated with flood events, they're pushing into these new areas, basically further out from the river. So it's not a grim story. I don't want to call it a grim story. This is the story that Jill and I are grappling to tell, because this is the reality of managing this plant over a long period of time in a river. So some takeaways and next steps. We did show that Jill and her consortium, I guess, of folks, they have showed that they can reduce knotweed through time, even in a changeable dynamic river, which is really quite astonishing and impressive. We can use landscape factors, to explain areas of establishment and persistence. And then I think that, one thing that is really important to me as a scientist is that, I think that it's difficult to document your monitoring and your control and your survey efforts. However, if they can be sustained over time, it can help us generalize these lessons for other areas. So some next steps, to keep surveying these small populations. And also I think what Jill has found is that because there's less knotweed to survey for, she has been able to use crew time to survey and manage it for these other species. So that has proved to be a useful kind of way to extend the work and keep it sustaining. The next step, we want to refine this landscape analysis using more factors and higher resolution. And then, we could, once we have this model, we could use it to predict invasion risk and spread and persistence on other rivers. And then lastly, I'm always doing this in general, but I think hopefully this work supports, development of data collection and data repositories and data information sharing at different scales for invasive species. So that is kind of an analysis of like this landscape scale, long-term data. I have another project that I've worked on, and this is in conjunction with Dave Heimer at DFW, where we looked at sequential use of Diquat for managing invasive knotweed. This is a pretty straightforward herbicide test. However, there's a lot of elements to it that I think are really important with respect to knotweed that I'll touch on. The reason that Dave initially sort of approached me, or we talked together about doing this, is that he works with tons of folks in the state that are trying and grappling to manage knotweed on these different areas. And this is just sort of from an informal survey that he did from folks that manage knotweed. Their treatment window is July to October. For the most part, it's not recommended to mechanically treat. Most people are using Imazapry, foliar. For the most part, you can get one site feed season. First year efficacy is pretty good, but successful control, of course, requires multiple visits. And then access is always a challenge. Land ownership, other, getting to riparian areas are always challenging. The idea is that we need to keep evaluating, and what Dave has mentioned is, and for me too, looking back at the history of Spartina. You look back at those older reports, in the early days where they were really grappling with how to do this, and they would try something and say, okay, well, that didn't. So I think that there's a need for this sort of ongoing building of the toolkit. On that note, what we were motivated for is to look at Diquat. Now, Diquat is a contact herbicide. And the motivation was partly because Diquat is labeled for aquatics. And Dave in particular was interested in seeing it be added to the aquatic noxious weed NPDES permit. However, there is also other work that has suggested that instead of mechanically mowing knotweed, seems to just make it mad. Different studies have tried to use contact herbicides as a kind of a chemical in order to improve control outcomes. There's two reasons for this. For one thing, it just cuts the biomass back so that you can get to it. The second reason, though, is that by forcing the plant to recover within the growing season, there's a hypothesis that it improves the uptake of a subsequent treatment with Imazapry or glyphosate, a systemic. So Diquat kind of met all of these things. It would allow us to test this contact herbicide. It is labeled for aquatics. However, we didn't have any label rates for invasive for how to treat invasive. So we saw an opportunity to kind of fill in a few different gaps. And this is a chart of all the different studies for knotweed and the different herbicides that have been tested. And if there's a gray box there, then it means that it has been tested, and a star means that it was considered very effective. And when we looked at how often Diquat had been tested on a knotweed, it was basically completely non-existent. So we thought, well, worst case scenario, we see and test this out and see what it does on this plant. It also has a different mode of action. So this is, what we did. We had a pretty straightforward experimental design in our timeline in early 2021. We set up our plots. We did an early season Diquat treatment, and then we evaluated at 2 weeks after, at 5 weeks after, at 8 weeks after. And then we did that sort of standard Imazapry treatment, and then we evaluated 1 year after. We did this in 3 sites and 4 replicates in each site. And then we had 3 Diquat concentrations, low, here, medium, and then high. And I can't remember exactly, but I believe it was based off of cattail, the concentration that Dave has seen with different cattail. That was kind of where those concentrations came from. And this is an example of a block. So it would be 4 treatment plots side by side. And, I just kind of threw, you'd have one of each of these in each treatment block. And then in each of our sites, we would have had 4 of these replicate blocks. Now our plot, this is going to be a little later. This is how it was challenging because we knew that the Diquat was going to reduce the biomass. So how do you assess effectiveness when you know that you're going in and you're already cutting, you're doing this chemical mow, if you will. So what we did is we have these plots that are 6 by 6, and we had 2 1-meter quadrats in there. And we had to measure multiple responses. We measured percent cover. We measured percent injury. However, the plants recovered really quickly. So percent injury kind of fell out. It ended up, but we also did stem counts in each of the quadrats, and we measured stem heights. And both of those became important in being able to assess a change in what we saw. Okay, this is another, I only have 1 plot because I really, I know that my time is getting short. So what I'm going to show you is the results for the stem heights. And what we did from stem heights is we extrapolated plants. So this section, this is before we treated anything. And then over here, each of these lines is low, the pinks are low, medium, and high, and then our black dotted line is controls. And over here, this is stem heights. So what you want to notice is that, pre-treatment, all of the plots, the stem heights, the distribution of stem heights looks exactly the same. When we treat with Diquat, and then 8 weeks later, all of our Diquat treatments are responding very similarly. And basically what you read this as is there's fewer, so this is a higher number of larger stems, this black line here in the control plots, and all of them have far fewer tall stems. Now, a year after, we've gone in at this point and we've treated with Imazapry, and so 1 with Diquat and 1 with Imazapry, and we've gone and looked at it a year later. A year later, we're seeing a difference. The low Diquat treatment is looking far more like the control plots. But the high and the medium Diquat treated plots do look different than the control plots. And so what we think is that high and medium Diquat concentrations are somehow, we're able to make the Imazapry more effective. However, we needed to do a longer term trial in order to really assess that. But basically the take homes from this is that, at 8 weeks after treatment, all of the Diquat treated plots are substantially reduced. So the plants have, the mass is not fully recovered. 52 weeks after, a year after the combined treatment, the low one looked really similar to the controls, but the medium and high concentration were reduced compared to controls. And we were able to use stem counts and heights to estimate biomass. I think that that's really important because, you know, you can have a difference in stem counts, or you can have a difference in stem heights. So the way that this looks in the field, this is our control plot, you know, before any treatment, and this is our control plot 8 weeks after, and this would have been our high Diquat treatment before, and then basically they kind of look the same. So, you know, the plants recover by 5 weeks after treatment, but the biomass is still significantly less at 8 weeks after treatment. And so the take home is that Diquat is going to reduce your biomass, but not your stem counts. And then we think this facilitates the subsequent Imazapry treatments. The Diquat and the Imazapry are at least as effective as the Imazapry alone, but we need to do a return trial to see if it actually improves the uptake and a longer term treatment. This method that I highly recommend the method evaluation that we used, and I'm happy to share it with anyone. We have a published page that can share it. But I think that it's really robust, and it's actually not that, it's not that difficult to collect these data, and it allows you to assess the difference between stem count and biomass. We obviously, by treating with Diquat, we're reducing the risk of flowering. And then it reduces the knotweed biomass for easier application and less product in the Imazapry and glyphosate. And we think that, you know, when folks are struggling, they have logistics, they've got crew, they've got access issues. Using these extended toolkits can sort of help us extend our treatment windows and have alternative options sometimes in order to treat plants. And then we provided information to ecology to support inclusion. This was just, so this is trying to tie two things together, is that, you know, I mentioned at the beginning, I am an environmentalist. I try and do research that promotes management and conservation. What I find is that I think that there is a need to do research at different levels. We need to understand how to have more effective treatment of, say, knotweed. We need to understand how to get that herbicide into the rhizomes, how to get translocation better. Have chia pet, you know, types of syndromes to deal with. And then we have things like hybridization all the way up to the influence of floods and how things like change and, you know, glacial retreat are even going to impact. And then, of course, the overarching trend in warming habits. So I think, you know, we have a need to walk and chew gum at the same time, and to do research that addresses all of these, and that we find ways to integrate this. I think that's all that I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Have you observed knotweed cuttings made by beaver on shorelines? We observed hundreds of cutting made by beaver germinating on the shore. East Fork Lewis County collection was key to mitigating spread. So I've seen that on the Chehalis. Actually, I was out with Elizabeth Seebacher and we were watching Nutria, I think, literally carrying chunks of knotweed across in its mouth. And so at least anecdotally, I would say that that seems to be a thing. I don't know if there's a lot of beaver in the Hoh. There's a ton of beaver in the Chehalis. And so that would be a place to kind of think about. But me personally, I've seen nutria specifically swimming around with knotweed chunks in their mouth, and we've seen beaver chewed cuttings of knotweed as well in the Chehalis. And then someone said, on the Hoh River, did your team switch to Imazapry to reduce knotweed resistance to glyphosate, or because it was more effective? That was in those 20 years of adaptive management lessons that I've now forgotten. What was the reason for the switch to Imazapry? I think it was, they started out by incorporating, they started out by adding Imazapry to the glyphosate, and noticed that it was more effective, and then ended up switching to Imazapry. But there were concerns because of residual. They were finding that the Imazapry resulting in killing off of native vegetation, thinking probably because it maybe has a higher residual. So they're still using Imazapry, but I think the goal was to try and be more targeted and try and avoid using it with native or around the vegetation. And so, yes, the residual, I can, if you email me, I can send you the summary that talks about the switch to Imazapry, and yes, there was some issues with seeing it being impacting native vegetation. I have been apprehensive to use Imazapry, so okay, 20 kill plants within a 20-foot reach. So that is another good question. Yes, similarly, again, in these 20 years of documents from the river, that did seem to be an issue. And I can actually, again, I'll put my email in, and I probably can get an updated answer to that question from Jill on how the Imazapry has been going, because when they first started using it, it was an issue. Does Diquat have a similar result? I don't think we know. I mean, in our treatment plots, for the most part, it was 100% Imazapry. I'm sorry, 100% knotweed in our treatment plots. There weren't other vegetation. So I'd have to look up the selectivity of Diquat. Possibility of biological control agents for knotweed. I don't know I know that Jen Parsons would be the person to talk to about biological control. And I believe that there are some not biological control agents in the works. But I don't know which ones they are. But Jen Parsons is on top of all the biological control stuff in this region. And then, did you see any biomass difference with the Diquat used in forested areas versus open full sun areas? That is an excellent question. So not with the Diquat. In fact, we had 3 sites that varied. Sorry, I'm trying to return back. Our 3 sites varied quite a bit in the amount of forestation. And we didn't really see a difference in change. What we did see was that the knotweed overall, the biomass of the knotweed in the forested sites was not as robust, as tall as it in the forested areas as it was in the sun areas. So it obviously does vary well. I mean, we get plenty of density of biomass in these forested areas, but the height of it didn't seem as large, and we just weren't getting overall amount of biomass to start with. So hopefully that answers your question and maybe lines up. And I think that lines up with what they're finding, what Jill has found on the Poe, is that it establishes and does plenty well in forested areas. It just probably isn't going to reach the same heights or maybe the same density, but it doesn't stop it from establishing and growing and persisting.
Thanks, everybody. And here's the contact information for speakers if you want that.